She stepped out of that black SUV like she already owned the street. Red dress, designer heels, a smile that said your life is about to change, and not in a way you'd enjoy. Vivian Sterling had demolished 14 neighborhoods to build her towers. She'd broken families, bought politicians, and buried more than a few careers without losing a minute of sleep. But the man standing in front of that rusted garage door? He didn't flinch, didn't negotiate. Just looked at her and said, "You haven't seen the inside." She laughed. The whole street laughed. Nobody's laughing now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like, if you're staying till the end. Let's go. The moving trucks had already started showing up on Maplewood Street 3 weeks before Vivian Sterling made her first visit in person. That was always how it worked. You sent the paperwork first, let the numbers do the talking. The assessed values, the buyout offers, the projected timelines. By the time a Sterling Group representative showed up at someone's door with a clipboard and a handshake, most people had already mentally started packing. The trucks were just confirmation. It had worked that way in Cartwright Heights, in the Delmore district, in the old Fenwick waterfront corridor that was now a cluster of glass and steel condominiums with a rooftop bar and monthly rents that would have made a Fenwick original blush. Vivian had learned early in her career that people didn't actually resist money. They resisted the idea of change. Once you separated those two things, once you made the money real and the change inevitable, most resistance dissolved within 72 hours. Maplewood Street was taking longer. She stood outside her company SUV on a Thursday morning in early March and looked down the length of the block with the particular kind of attention she reserved for things that were about to stop existing. The houses were modest, mostly post-war construction, some of them well-kept and some of them fighting a losing battle against their own age. The oaks lining the sidewalk were beautiful. She'd give it that. Tall and old, the kind that took 100 years to grow and 15 minutes to cut down. Her assistant, Marcus, materialized at her elbow with a tablet already open. 15 of 17 original homeowners have signed, he said. We're at 88%. The Barrera family on the East End finally came through yesterday morning. And the two? Eleanor Whitmore, 73, southeast corner. She's dug in. Says she wants to die in that house. He paused. Her words, not mine. Make the offer again. Double it if you have to. Frame it around her grandchildren. Vivian was still looking at the block. What about the other one? Marcus hesitated. That half-second pause was enough for Vivian to pull her attention away from the oak trees. Hayes, he said. Nolan Hayes. The property at 44. She looked where he was pointing. About 2/3 of the way down the block, a house sat behind a modest front yard with a cracked concrete path and a maple tree that had lifted one corner of the front walk clean off the ground. The house itself was unremarkable, vinyl siding that had been white once and was now closer to the color of old newspaper, a front porch with 2 wooden chairs, windows that were clean even if the frames around them were peeling. But it was the garage that caught her eye. It sat beside the house, accessible from a side gate in a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that served as a driveway. The garage was old, older than the house maybe, or at least weathered worse. The exterior was corrugated steel that had gone the color of rust, patched in 2 places with mismatched sheet metal, and the roll-up door had a dent in the lower right panel that had been there long enough to look permanent. A padlock hung from a bolt hasp that looked newer than everything else by about 20 years. Vivian stared at it for a moment. That's an eyesore, she said. The property has some complications, Marcus said carefully. What kind of complications? Mr. Hayes has declined all contact. Not just the offers, the contact. Our representatives have knocked 3 times. He acknowledges them, says he's received the materials, and then says he's not interested in discussing it further. Vivian looked at him. He said not interested in discussing it? Twice. The 3rd time he said, and I'm reading directly here, Marcus looked at his tablet. Tell your employer to stop sending people to my house. I know what you're offering. The answer is no. Then he went back inside. She turned back to the garage. A cat was sitting on top of a ceramic planter near the garage's side wall, watching her with the complete indifference that cats reserve for people they'd already assessed and found unimpressive. Set up a meeting, she said. He's refused. Not a meeting at his door. I'll go myself. Today. She was already moving down the sidewalk. What do we know about him? Marcus fell into step behind her, scrolling. 41 years old, single, widowed about 6 years ago. One daughter, Lily, she's 12. He works as a... Marcus paused, and she heard his finger stop on the screen. His current employment is listed as independent engineering consultant, self-employed, registered with the state, but the company is basically a one-man operation. Hayes Mechanical Solutions. No employees, no client list we've been able to identify publicly. He pays his property taxes on time. No liens, no debt we can find. The house is paid off. Paid off. She didn't frame it as a question, but it landed like one. Clear title. No mortgage. He's been there 11 years. She walked along the cracked sidewalk in front of his property, and from here she could see a little more. The side of the garage, where a small window sat high on the wall and had been covered from the inside with what looked like heavy black paper. A rubber seal ran along the bottom of the roll-up door that was too good, too new, too precisely installed for the rest of the structure. Like someone had rebuilt the guts of the thing while leaving the outside to look like it was falling apart. She filed that away. There was a man in the driveway. She'd almost missed him because he was crouched behind a weathered sawhorse with a notebook in his hand, making what appeared to be measurements along the crease where the driveway met the side wall of the garage. He had dark hair that needed a cut, a gray Henley pushed up to the elbows, and the kind of forearms that came from actual work rather than a gym. He looked up as she approached the edge of his property. He didn't stand, just looked at her. "Mr. Hayes," Vivian said. She kept her tone warm. She was good at warm when she needed to be. "I'm Vivian Sterling, Sterling Group. I believe we've had some trouble connecting." "Your people connected fine," he said. "I just didn't have anything different to tell them." His voice was even. Not cold, not hostile, just level, like a road with no hills. He held her gaze without any of the subtle discomfort most people showed when they met her for the first time in person. She was aware in the way she was always aware of the impression she made. The dress, the heels, the practiced composure. She'd learned to use all of it. He looked at her the way he'd probably look at a car he was thinking of buying, noting the details, reserving judgment. "I'd like to talk directly," she said, "about your property, about what we're trying to do here." "I know what you're trying to do," he said. He stood up, unhurried, and tucked the notebook into the back pocket of his jeans. He was taller than she'd expected. 44,000 square feet of luxury residential and mixed-use commercial, 22 stories at the east end, 18 at the west. I read the project proposal. She blinked. "Where did you—" "It was filed with the city planning office. It's public record." He wasn't unkind about it, just informative. The zoning variance request was in there too. I read that part twice. Vivian recalibrated. "Then you understand the scale of what we're building, the value it would bring to this neighborhood. To the people who live in the new building," he said, "not to the people who live here now. We're offering fair market value plus 30%. Miss Sterling," he said it gently, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been sharp. "I'm not selling. I've been pretty clear about that. And I don't want to take up your morning repeating myself." He looked down at his notebook, then back up at her. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" She looked at the garage again. This close, she could see the padlock more clearly. Heavy-duty, commercial grade, the kind used for storage units and equipment lockers. She could also see what she'd noticed from down the block, that rubber door seal, fresh and precise against the cracked asphalt. "That garage," she said, "it's bringing down every property value on the block." Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite offense. Something in between. "Is that right?" "It looks abandoned. Whatever's in there, tools," he said simply. "Equipment. My business." She looked at the rusted exterior, the patched steel, the decade of visible neglect. She let her expression say what she was thinking. "Mr. Hayes, that building is an eyesore. You must know that." He looked at the garage, looked back at her, and then he said it, the thing that would stay with her for weeks. "You haven't seen the inside." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't defensive. It was the flattest, most matter-of-fact sentence she'd heard in longer than she could remember, delivered the way you'd tell someone the time if they asked. A simple statement of fact that contained no particular invitation, but somehow refused to be dismissed. She almost said something sharp. She didn't. "Have a good morning, Mr. Hayes," she said instead. She walked back to the SUV with Marcus half a step behind her. "Well," he said quietly. "Find out everything there is to know about him," she said. "And I mean everything." Bao. She didn't usually do her own research. That's what she had Marcus for, and before Marcus there had been Denise, and before Denise a rotating cast of sharp young people who understood that working for Vivian Sterling meant being good at finding things and bad at sleeping in. But that night, alone in her apartment on the 34th floor of the building she'd developed 7 years ago in what used to be the Cartwright Heights industrial corridor, Vivian found herself in front of her laptop with a glass of Montepulciano and a Google search bar. Nolan Hayes, engineer. Not much. A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 6 years. The last entry was a position at a company called Meridian Automotive Technologies, listed as Senior Principal Engineer, Advanced Propulsion Systems. Before that, 2 years at a German firm she didn't recognize. Before that, graduate school at MIT. She sat with that for a moment. MIT, German automotive firm. Senior principal engineer at what she now Googled and discovered was a mid-sized but highly regarded automotive engineering company that had since been acquired by a larger conglomerate. She found a few technical papers with his name attached, dense, impenetrable things about combustion optimization and hybrid drivetrain architecture. The kind of publications that meant nothing to her but which carried the weight of serious credentials. He'd left Meridian 6 years ago, around the time she guessed that he'd lost his wife. After that, nothing. No papers, no conference appearances, no professional activity she could find, just a sole proprietor registration in the state database, a paid-off house, a rusty garage, and a 12-year-old daughter named Lily. She picked up her wine and looked out at the city. Below her, the lights of what used to be Fenwick waterfront blazed and pulsed, people moving through it like blood through something new and healthy. She'd built that. She'd taken a corridor of abandoned warehouses and broken loading docks and built something that generated $300 million of assessed property value and housed 40 retail tenants and over 1,200 residents. She was proud of it. She was supposed to be proud of it. She thought about the man in the driveway with the notebook and the even voice and the flat, certain way he'd looked at her. "You haven't seen the inside." She closed the laptop and went to bed. She lay awake for an hour. The next morning, Vivian's phone rang at 7:14 while she was in the back of her car heading to the office. It was Marcus. "I have an update on Hayes," he said without preamble. "Go ahead." "I reached out to some contacts in the automotive engineering space, specifically to a friend of a friend who worked at Meridian Technologies before the acquisition. She remembered Hayes." Vivian watched the city move past the window. "And?" she said. Marcus paused, and she could hear him choosing words carefully, which he only did when what he was about to say was going to change something. "She said he was the kind of engineer you only meet once in your career." Her words. She said the work he was doing on hybrid propulsion systems was 5 years ahead of anything anyone else in the industry was attempting. She said when he left, people thought it was temporary, a personal leave, a break. Nobody thought he was actually gone. But he was. He was. A beat. She also said something else. She said the project he was working on when he left, the thing he was closest to, he never handed it off. When he resigned, he retained ownership of his personal research under the terms of his employment contract. She said Meridian tried to contest it and failed. Vivian sat forward slightly. He kept his research. Whatever he was building, he took it with him. She thought about the garage, the commercial-grade padlock, the black paper over the interior window, the rubber door seal that was too new, too precise. "Find me a reason to go back to that house," she said. "Miss Sterling, not a sales pitch. I need a reason that isn't about the sale, something legitimate." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "There's a community meeting Thursday evening. The city planning office is holding an open session on the project. All residents of the affected block were formally notified. It's a public meeting. Will he be there?" If he's paying attention, and based on what we know, he is, probably yes. "Good," she said. "I'll be there too." The community meeting was held in the basement of the Maplewood Branch Library, a low-slung building with water-stained ceiling tiles and folding chairs that had known better decades. About 30 people came. Some faces Vivian recognized from her previous visit to the street. some she didn't. The signed resident sat on one side, looking mostly resigned and a little relieved. Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who wanted to die in her house, sat in the front row with her arms crossed and an expression that could have stripped paint. Nolan Hayes came in 4 minutes late and took a seat near the back, alone. He was dressed the same way he'd been the day she met him. Jeans, a plain shirt, sleeves already pushed up even though it wasn't warm in the basement. He had a small notebook with him, the same battered one she'd seen in the driveway. He uncapped a pen and looked at the front of the room where the city planning representative was adjusting a projector. Vivian was already seated at the presenter's table to one side, there in her capacity as project developer. She watched him settle in. He didn't scan the room the way people usually did when they arrived late, that quick, guilty sweep. He just sat down and directed his attention forward. He noticed her, though. A brief look, acknowledgement without much in it, and then he was watching the projector. The city planner, a tired-looking man named Gerald Peck, ran through the project overview with the enthusiasm of someone reading instructions for a piece of furniture. Square footage, projected tax revenue, environmental impact study summary, affordable housing set-aside percentage, which was 12%, which Eleanor Whitmore immediately announced was an insult, which generated the first actual energy in the room. Vivian handled the pushback the way she always did, calmly, with data, redirecting emotion toward process. She was good in these rooms. She knew when to agree, when to hold firm, and when to say that's an excellent point in a way that closed the conversation without conceding anything. About 40 minutes in, during a discussion about construction timelines, a hand went up in the back. Nolan Hayes. "Mr. Hayes," the city planner said, looking down at his list with the slight surprise of someone who hadn't expected him to engage. "The environmental impact study summary you're presenting," Hayes said. His voice carried easily in the low-ceilinged room. "Does it address the water table assessment for this block specifically? Or is it the district-wide assessment from 2021? Gerald Peck looked at his notes, then at his laptop, then at Vivian. "The 2021 district assessment," he said after a moment, "was used as the baseline. The 2021 assessment predates the remediation work done on the Kellner industrial site 2 blocks east," Hayes said. He wasn't aggressive about it. He might have been talking about weather. That remediation changed the drainage pattern for this entire micro-watershed. A site-specific assessment would show different groundwater behavior than what you're projecting from that baseline. The room had gone very quiet. "The foundation engineering for a 22-story structure in this location needs site-specific water table data," Hayes continued. "The 2021 numbers will underestimate hydrostatic pressure at depth. That's not a small error." Gerald Peck looked like a man who had not expected his Thursday evening to go this direction. Vivian looked at Hayes. He had his notebook open and had been writing as he spoke, like he was transcribing his own thoughts in real time. "Mr. Hayes," she said. She kept her voice neutral and professional. "Thank you for raising that. It's a legitimate technical question, and we'll have our engineers respond in writing." He looked at her. "I'd appreciate that," he said, and then he looked back at his notebook and wrote something else. After the meeting, people dispersed slowly, the way they always did when there wasn't enough coffee and too much anxiety. Vivian was packing up her materials when she realized Hayes hadn't left yet. He was standing near the exit, talking to Eleanor Whitmore, the front row woman with the crossed arms, who had her hand on his forearm and was saying something Vivian couldn't hear. She crossed the room. It wasn't quite a calculated move and wasn't quite an impulse, something in between. "Mrs. Whitmore," Vivian said when she was close enough, "I want to set up some additional time to talk about your specific concerns." Eleanor Whitmore looked at her with the expression of a woman who had outlasted 4 mayors and 2 recessions and was not particularly threatened by a developer in a red dress. "You and I talked plenty," Eleanor said. "I told you what I told you." Then she patted Hayes's arm and shuffled toward the door. Vivian was left standing about 3 feet from Nolan Hayes, which was the closest she'd been to him. She'd noticed before, in a clinical way, that he wasn't bad-looking. The kind of face that had probably been handsome in a more obvious way when he was younger, and had since settled into something more irregular and specific, with a jaw that needed a shave and eyes that were darker than she'd expected up close. He was watching her with mild, polite attention. "The question you raised," she said, "you'd actually looked into the remediation timeline." I looked into it before the first letter arrived, he said. When I found out what was planned, I read everything I could find about the site. That's usually how I start. You start by reading everything. It saves time later. She studied him for a moment. What would it take? He looked at her steadily. Ms. Sterling, I'm not negotiating right now, she said. I'm asking, genuinely, not money. I understand that money isn't the obstacle. So what is it? What would it actually take? He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, There's nothing you can offer that's a substitute for what I have there. What do you have there? She asked, and she meant it as a real question. He picked up his jacket from the back of a nearby chair. My daughter. My wife's garden. 11 years of work. He paused. Some other things. She thought about the garage. I'll answer your engineer's question in writing too, he said. About the water table. They should fix that before they build anything. He walked out. It was 2 days later that Vivian ran into a name she recognized. She'd asked Marcus to dig deeper, specifically into Hayes's work at Meridian Technologies, beyond the public record. Marcus had reached out through 3 degrees of professional separation and come back with a name. Clifford Drummond, 61, recently retired from a position as VP of Engineering Development at the company that had acquired Meridian. Drummond had been Hayes's supervisor at Meridian for 2 years. He was in the city for a conference. He agreed to meet her for lunch. He was a compact man with the kind of sunburn that suggested recent retirement somewhere warm, and he spent the first several minutes of their lunch establishing that he hadn't come to say anything that would get him in trouble. I want to understand who he is, Vivian said. Background, capabilities. What kind of engineer? Drummond studied his water glass. Nolan Hayes is the best engineer I ever worked with, he said, and I've worked with a lot of engineers. Can you be more specific? Specifically, he seemed to be choosing every word. He had an ability to look at a system, a mechanical system, a propulsion system, a complex interaction of components, and understand it at a level that most engineers never reach. Not just understand the math, understand why. Why something worked, why it failed, why it could work differently if you approached it from a different angle. He turned his water glass slowly. Most engineering is optimization. You take a known design and you make it more efficient, cheaper, lighter, faster. That's 95% of the work. Hayes didn't do that. He looked at the known design and said, this whole approach is wrong, and then showed you why, and then showed you the better approach. And the project he took with him when he left. Drummond's expression changed in a way that was hard to characterize. Not quite pride, not quite regret. We tried to keep it, he said. Legally. We argued that it was developed using company resources, company time. But he'd structured his employment agreement very carefully, with very specific language about retained intellectual property on personal research developed outside of work hours. He paused. I say personal research. I mean the project he was working on in his off hours for the last 2 years he was with us, on his own equipment, at his own expense. He kept meticulous records of the separation. Every hour, every component, every calculation, documented separately, time-stamped, airtight. He shook his head slightly. He'd been thinking about that exit for a while. We just didn't know it. What was the project? Drummond looked at her for a long moment. Why do you want to know? He owns a property I need. I'm trying to understand the obstacle. The obstacle, Drummond said slowly, is that Nolan Hayes has never, in my experience, done anything without a very complete and considered reason. If he's not selling that property, there's a reason that matters to him more than money, and that reason probably isn't going away. He folded his napkin. The project he took with him. I can tell you it was in the advanced propulsion space, high-efficiency hybrid architecture. But I saw some of the early-stage documentation before he left, and what he was attempting it was beyond anything I'd seen, not just incremental, foundational. He met her eyes. If he's been working on it for the last 6 years, in that garage you're trying to demolish, I would be very careful about the assumptions you're making. She drove back to the office with the window down, even though it was cold, the March air sharp and unfiltered. She was thinking about a rust-colored garage on Maplewood Street and a padlock that was far too serious for the structure it protected. You haven't seen the inside. She hadn't. that was still true. And Saturday mornings on Maplewood Street had a different temperature than the rest of the week. The light came in low through the oak branches, and people moved differently. Not the clipped, purposeful movement of the workday, but something looser and less defended. Mrs. Petrov, from number 31, walked her enormous dog in a bathrobe she'd clearly been wearing since the Carter administration. The Torres kids from number 18 ran through a sprinkler someone had left out since the previous fall, seemingly indifferent to the fact that it was 43 degrees. 2 doors down from the Torres house, an old man named Abe sat on his front steps with coffee and the printed newspaper that he was one of perhaps 11 people in the country still receiving. Vivian wasn't supposed to be here. She told herself she was going to drive by. Just drive by, take another look at the block from the car, think about the project. That was what she told herself. She'd parked on the corner and walked down the sidewalk, and that was something different, and she knew it. From the far end of the block, she could see Hayes's property. The maple tree was just starting to bud. The first green on Maplewood Street, she noticed, which struck her as either meaningless or resonant depending on your disposition. The front porch had a light on, even in daylight, the warm amber kind that suggested someone inside making breakfast. She was about 30 feet from the edge of his property when she heard the laughter. It came from the side of the house. A girl's laugh, bright and with a rough edge to it, the kind of laugh that came from actual surprise rather than politeness. And then she heard Hayes's voice, lower, saying something she couldn't catch. And then the laughter again. She slowed. Around the side of the house, near the side gate to the driveway, a girl was crouched in the remnants of a winter-dead garden bed, holding what appeared to be a trowel in one hand and a coffee can in the other. She was maybe 11 or 12, with her father's dark hair pulled back unevenly and dirt on both knees of her jeans. Hayes was crouched beside her, and whatever they were doing involved the coffee can and some kind of soil amendment he was working into the dirt with his hands. They hadn't seen her. She watched them for a moment longer than she intended. The girl said something, and Hayes looked at whatever she was pointing at and nodded. And then he sat back on his heels and gestured at the garden bed in a way that looked like explanation, like he was walking her through something step by step, and she was mostly interested but occasionally distracted. The girl asked something, and Hayes answered, and the girl answered back, and it was ordinary in particular and had nothing whatsoever to do with Vivian Sterling or the Sterling Group or 44,000 square feet of mixed-use residential. She turned and walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for 2 minutes without starting the engine. Then she pulled out her phone and called Marcus. "I need you to get Drummond's contact information," she said, "not for a follow-up. I need to know specifically about the research project Hayes was working on at Meridian. Not what it was, whether there's any industry documentation of it, any trace in the professional literature of what he was attempting. Why specifically?" She watched an oak leaf drift down and land on her windshield. "Because I think we've been looking at this wrong," she said. "We've been treating him like a holdout, a stubborn homeowner sitting on a piece of property he's attached to for sentimental reasons." She paused. "I think he might be sitting on something else entirely." Marcus was quiet for a beat. "What kind of something else?" She thought about Drummond's voice when he'd said the word foundational, the particular quality of someone describing something they'd seen only partially, but which had been enough. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what I need you to find out." She started the car and drove away from Maplewood Street, and the whole way back to her apartment she could still hear that girl laughing at something her father had said in the garden, the sound of it ordinary and weightless, completely unaware of the forces that had decided to arrange themselves around their small piece of the world. The call came Sunday evening while she was reviewing site plans. Marcus. She answered on the second ring. "I found something," he said. "It took a while because it's not in any public publication. But there's a conference, Advanced Propulsion Engineering Summit 2018, Technical Symposium. Drummond presented a paper there, not about Hayes specifically, but about a class of hybrid energy conversion architecture that he described as emerging from proprietary research. He didn't name Hayes, but the architecture he described is specific enough that someone in the industry would know. And? I reached out to 2 engineers from that conference. Both of them said the same thing, independently. A pause. They said if that research was completed, it would be the most significant advancement in automotive propulsion in 30 years. One of them said, and again, direct quote, Whoever finishes that project holds the keys to the next generation of high-performance hybrid engineering. The site plans blurred in front of her, and Hayes has been in that garage, she said slowly, for 6 years. Working on something, Marcus said. We don't know what. We know what direction, she said. She set down her pen. She looked at the site plans, the clean architectural lines, the footprint dimensions, the color-coded zoning overlays, the little square on the map that was 44 Maplewood Street, the garage she'd called an eyesore. Marcus, she said. Yeah, cancel my Monday morning. What should I tell? Tell them I'm doing site assessment, she said, which is true. She ended the call and sat in the quiet of her apartment with the site plans in front of her and the city going about its Sunday business 40 floors below. You haven't seen the inside. No, she hadn't. And suddenly, for the first time in her professional life, she found herself genuinely uncertain about what she was going to find when she did. Monday came gray and cold, the kind of morning that made the city feel like it was still deciding whether to bother with the day. Vivian was on Maplewood Street by 8:15. She hadn't slept particularly well. Not from anxiety. She'd learned years ago to separate the feeling of a problem from the problem itself, to let one sit in a drawer overnight while she rested. What had kept her awake was something closer to the feeling she got before an acquisition that she couldn't fully price. The particular discomfort of incomplete information on something that mattered. She stood on the sidewalk across from number 44 with a coffee she'd picked up 2 blocks away and looked at the property in the flat morning light. The maple tree threw no shadow yet. The sun was still too low and too diffuse, but the first buds she'd noticed Saturday were still there, small and closed and faintly green against the gray. The front porch light was off now. The house looked empty, though she knew it probably wasn't. The garage looked exactly the same as it always did. Rust and patched steel and the too serious padlock hanging from its bolt hasp, like a period at the end of a sentence someone meant. She'd been standing there maybe 5 minutes when the front door opened. Lily Hayes came out first, backpack on one shoulder, eating a piece of toast with the careless efficiency of someone who'd learned that breakfast was a function, not an event. She was wearing a green hoodie and jeans with a hole in one knee that looked earned rather than purchased, and she had her father's way of moving, unhurried, deliberate, taking up exactly the space she needed. She jumped off the porch steps rather than walking down them, landed with a small bounce, and started up the front path. Nolan Hayes came out behind her, pulling the door shut. He had his jacket half on and keys already in his hand, the kind of multitasking that read as muscle memory. He said something to Lily's back, and she said something over her shoulder without turning around, and he smiled at it. A quick, private thing that wasn't for anyone else. Then he looked up and saw Vivian across the street. The smile stayed on his face for another second in the way expressions sometimes do when the brain hasn't caught up with the eyes yet. Then it settled into something more neutral. He finished putting his jacket on, said something to Lily, who stopped and looked across the street with open curiosity before looking back at her father and then continuing to the end of the walk, where she stopped and waited. Hayes crossed the street. "Ms. Sterling," he said. Not aggressive, a little like finding something on your doorstep that required a decision. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this is early. I was hoping to catch you before your day started." He glanced at Lily, who was standing at the end of the walk watching them with the frank, assessing attention that 12-year-olds haven't yet learned to disguise. "I need to drop her at school. It's on my way. Can this wait 20 minutes?" "Of course." He nodded once and walked back across the street. She watched him say something to Lily as they walked. Explanatory, she guessed, from the way Lily glanced back at her one more time with that evaluating look before they turned the corner. She finished her coffee standing on the sidewalk. Abe came out of his house 2 doors down and gave her the slightly confused look of a man who'd seen this woman before in an official capacity and wasn't sure what to make of her unscheduled reappearance. She nodded at him. He nodded back and collected his newspaper and went inside. 22 minutes later, Hayes came back around the corner alone. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and was walking at the same pace he always seemed to walk, which was just slightly slower than urgency. He crossed to where she was standing without any particular ceremony. "You want to come inside?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "If that's all right." He considered her for a moment. "Coffee?" Please. The inside of the house was what she'd expected in some ways, and not in others. It was lived in the way houses get when one practical adult and one growing child occupy them without much interest in performance. There were books, more than she'd anticipated, and not organized by any system she could identify, stacked on shelves and side tables, and one particular corner of the living room that had essentially become an auxiliary library. A pair of Lily's sneakers sat in the middle of the hallway in a way that suggested this was a recurring location for them rather than an accident. The kitchen had a wall calendar with Lily's schedule written in two different handwriting styles. Neat block letters for what she guessed was school-related, looser cursive for what she guessed was everything else. It smelled like coffee and something faintly metallic that she associated with workshop spaces. Hayes moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd made coffee in this room approximately 4,000 times, and she sat at the kitchen table, which had a scratch across one end and a ring stain that no amount of whatever had been tried had fully removed. "I did some research," she said, when he set a mug in front of her and sat down across from her with his own. "I figured," he said. "Clifford Drummond." Something shifted in his face. Not defensiveness, exactly. Wariness. The way someone looks when they hear a name they weren't expecting in a context where it doesn't belong. "You talked to Cliff." "I had lunch with him last week. He spoke highly of you. Cliff's a good engineer." He said it simply, without embellishment or elaboration. He said you were the best he'd worked with. Hayes drank his coffee. "That's generous." "He also said," she said carefully, "that what you were working on when you left Meridian was something he'd call foundational. His word." Hayes was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just thinking. "What exactly did you tell him you wanted to know?" "I told him I was trying to understand who you were, background and capability. I was honest about why." "And he told you about the project?" "He told me it existed. He didn't tell me what it was specifically. I think he doesn't fully know." She held her mug in both hands. "I know you've been working on something in that garage for 6 years, and I know enough about the space you were working in to understand that if you've completed it, or come close, it's worth considerably more than what we're offering for the property." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. "So now you're here because you want to buy the research instead of the house." "I'm here because I've been approaching this wrong," she said. "I've been treating you like an obstacle. I'd like to understand you instead." He set his mug down on the table, on the ring stain, in what she guessed was its habitual spot. "That's a better sentence than most of what your people have said to me," he acknowledged, "but it's still a negotiating position." "Maybe," she said. "Does that make it untrue?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the window over the sink where the morning light was coming in flat and gray-white through the glass, and he seemed to be turning something over internally. "I'm not selling the research," he said finally. "I'm not selling the house. I'm not selling the garage." He looked back at her. "That's not going to change." "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" She wasn't entirely sure. That was the honest answer. She was sitting in this kitchen for a reason she couldn't fully articulate even to herself. Something that had started with a rusted garage and a flat 8-word sentence and had evolved into something more complicated in a way that surprised her. "I'm asking you to explain something to me," she said. "You're clearly not here by accident. You have a paid-off house and a contained life, and you've walked away from what was obviously a significant career. Why here? Why this block? Why that garage?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My wife grew up 2 blocks from here," he said. "We found this house when Lily was a year old. The garage came with it." He paused. "It had been used as storage for the previous 30 years. Boxes, lawn furniture, Christmas stuff. It took me 6 months to clear it out." Something moved across his face. "She thought I was going to make it into a woodworking shop. I let her think that for a while." "What did you make it into?" He looked at her steadily. "A lab." She sat with that. "6 years ago, when you left Meridian, when my wife died," he said, "I needed to be here. Not in another city. Not at a company where the work mattered more than the people doing it. I needed to be in a place where Lily could walk to school and I could be home when she got back and the neighbors knew her name." He picked up his mug again. "The work came with me because I wasn't done with it. The two things aren't in conflict." "The work," she said. Is it done? He looked at her, and she could see him making a decision. Parts of it, he said. The main architecture is complete. What's left is refinement, testing. He paused. Documentation for filing. Patent filing? Some of it's already filed, he said. The foundational claims, the rest is in process. She nodded slowly. The picture she'd been assembling over the past week sharpened a little more. A man who had spent 6 years in a garage on a residential street quietly completing work that an industry had been attempting for decades. At the same time raising his daughter alone, maintaining the garden his wife had left, answering his door when the neighbors needed something. She thought about what it would take to do that, the discipline of it, the particular kind of devotion that didn't announce itself. Why haven't you taken it to market? She asked. I will, he said, when it's ready. How close is ready? He almost smiled. That's a question I'm not going to answer in my kitchen at 8:30 in the morning to someone who works in real estate. She laughed, a short, genuine thing that surprised her slightly. Fair. Ms. Sterling. He set his mug down again. I understand what you're building. I understand why this block makes sense for it. I've read the project plans and they're not stupid, and the tax revenue argument is legitimate. He laced his hands on the table. But I'm not a holdout. I'm not waiting for a better offer. This is not something that has a number attached to it, and I think you're starting to understand that. He met her eyes. I think you came here this morning because you're smart enough to realize that, and you're not sure what to do with it. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum and a car passing outside. You're right, she said. He nodded once. I know. Then, with unexpected directness, what do you actually want here? Not for the project, for yourself. The question landed in a way she hadn't prepared for. She looked at the ring stain on the table for a moment. I'm not sure I know how to answer that. That's an honest answer, he said. Most people in your position don't give honest answers. She stood, because the conversation had reached a place where continuing it felt like pressing on something that needed to be left alone. She picked up her bag. Thank you for the coffee. Sure. She was halfway to the kitchen doorway when he said, the water table issue from the planning meeting. She turned. I sent the technical notes to the city planning office this morning, copied to your company's project engineer. I got the address from the permit filings. He was still sitting with his coffee, unhurried. The problem is fixable. It needs a modified foundation design, but it's not a project killer. Whoever you have doing the structural work should be able to handle it if they know about it. She stared at him. You sent notes to our engineer. I sent the calculation summary and the relevant remediation data. It's in the public record anyway. It just needs to be in the right file. He looked at her with that level, unreadable expression. I'm not your enemy, Ms. Sterling. I just can't give you what you're asking for. She drove away from Maplewood Street for the second time in 3 days, with the particular sensation of having misjudged the dimensions of something significantly. The weeks that followed settled into a strange kind of parallel movement. The Sterling Group's Maplewood project moved forward. Permits progressed, the construction timeline was formalized, architects finalized the upper floor designs. 11 of the 17 original holdouts had now signed. Eleanor Whitmore remained a fixture in the front row of every meeting category. Nolan Hayes remained uncommunicative on the subject of the sale, responding to the one additional formal offer Marcus sent with a brief, polite email that said, "Thank you for following up. My position hasn't changed." But other things were moving too. Vivian found herself reading automotive engineering literature in the evenings, which was not something that had ever previously occurred to her as a use of her time. Not the technical papers, those were beyond her training, but the industry coverage, trade publications, investor reports on companies pursuing advanced hybrid technology, patent filings in the propulsion space that mentioned the same subarchitecture Drummond had described in his 2018 paper. She began to understand, dimly but with increasing clarity, the shape of what might be in that garage. Marcus noticed the direction her attention was drifting, and to his credit, said nothing about it directly. He simply began including relevant industry updates in her morning briefings, the way he always folded in what he knew she needed without requiring her to ask twice. In the 3rd week of March, he put a name in front of her, Randall Croft. He's in town, Marcus said. He's a senior partner at Croft Ellison Capital. They do early-stage investment in IP-heavy technology companies, primarily in the automotive and clean energy spaces. He knew Hayes at Meridian, not as a colleague, as a potential investor. He tried to get meetings with him about 5 years ago and got politely stonewalled. He paused. He's been trying again recently. My contact says he's been making calls. Vivian looked up from the report she was reviewing. Croft is trying to reconnect with Hayes? Apparently someone in the industry, probably more than one someone, is paying closer attention to the patent filings coming out of Hayes Mechanical Solutions. Marcus sat down across from her desk. If the foundational patents are in process, the filings are public. Anyone who knows what to look for would see them. She thought about that. Hayes said refinement and testing, that the main architecture was complete. If that's true, he's close to something that people are going to want very badly. Has Croft made contact? Sent a letter to the business address on the state registration. 3 weeks ago. No response yet, based on what my contact knows. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. What's Croft Ellison's play if they get access to the research? Licensing. They'd structure a deal to license the technology to manufacturers. They take a percentage and Hayes would take the majority, in theory. But the control structure depends entirely on how the deal is written. He let that land without emphasis. And if Hayes doesn't have representation? He's a solo engineer who's been in a garage for 6 years, Marcus said carefully. He's smart, but smart at engineering and smart at deal structure are 2 different skill sets. Vivian turned her chair toward the window. Outside, the city was going about its efficient Tuesday, indifferent to the conversation happening 30 floors above it. Get me a meeting with Croft, she said, as a professional courtesy. 2 people who know the same name. She turned back. I want to understand what he's looking for. Croft was a tall man with the particular kind of confidence that came from decades of making good bets and knowing it. He wore an open-collar shirt under a jacket and had the handshake of someone who'd given a lot of them. He met her at a restaurant she knew slightly too well, the kind of place where the booths were deep enough for private conversation and the ambient noise level had been calibrated accordingly. They got through the pleasantries in 4 minutes, which she respected. Nolan Hayes, he said, once the waiter had come and gone. You've been trying to reach him. For about a month. He turned his water glass. Before that, I tried about 5 years ago and got a very polite, not interested yet response. I respected that and moved on. He looked at her. The recent patent activity tells me yet might be becoming soon. What do the filings tell you? He considered her for a moment, deciding how much. They tell me he's completed a hybrid energy conversion system with an efficiency curve that, if the specs hold, makes everything currently on the market look like it was designed in the previous century. He said it without drama. The math in the foundational claims is verifiable. Someone very good did it. I had 2 engineers review the public filings independently. They came back with the same conclusion. What conclusion? That if the complete system performs to spec, it's a generational advancement, not incremental. He paused. Ms. Sterling, I'm going to be direct. I know you're trying to acquire his property for a development project. I know he hasn't sold. I'm not interested in the property. I'm interested in the technology. Those 2 things shouldn't be in conflict. They're not, she said. I have no interest in his technology. Then, what's your interest in this conversation? She picked up her water. I'm trying to understand the full picture of a situation I'm in the middle of. Hayes has something valuable. He's not fully connected to the people who could translate that value into something for him. She met Croft's eyes. I'd rather understand that landscape before it develops in a direction that creates more complications. Croft studied her. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? A developer trying to find an angle. He tilted his head slightly. Maybe that's what you are. And I'm just not seeing it yet. Maybe, she said. But I'm also telling you that if you go in heavy, if you approach Hayes the way investors typically approach independent inventors, you'll get the same not interested response you got 5 years ago. She set down her water. He's not naive. He's been preparing for this for longer than you'd think. How do you know that? Because I talked to him, she said. And because I talked to Drummond. Something moved in Croft's expression. You talked to Cliff. He told me Hayes structured his departure from Meridian very carefully. IP retention, time-stamped records, Documented ownership of everything. She paused. He's not someone who left the professional world because he couldn't handle it. He left because he had something specific to do, and he needed to do it on his own terms. Croft was quiet for a moment. He's still going to need capital to take this to market. Even if the licensing path is clean, the testing validation process, the manufacturing partner negotiations, those require resources. He knows that, she said. I think he's known it for a while. I think he's just been waiting until the position was strong enough that the terms would be his. Croft looked at her with something that was close to respect and close to frustration in roughly equal measure. You know more about his situation than a real estate developer has any particular reason to. She smiled. I've been paying attention. He sat back. What do you want from me? I want you to not approach Hayes like a transaction, she said. Not yet. Let him come to you when he's ready. If you push before the work is complete, you'll lose him. And what do you get out of that advice? Nothing directly, she said. But I'm tired of miscalculating what's happening on that street, and this is part of it. Croft nodded slowly. He seemed to be making decisions she couldn't see. If he reaches out, he said finally, I'll let you know. That's all I'm asking. She drove home that evening through the early spring dark, the city's lights beginning to matter again as the days grew tentatively longer. She thought about Nolan Hayes in that garage, working on something she couldn't see, that she'd mocked without knowing, that had been quietly accumulating value and weight while the world around it assumed it was just rust and dead space. She thought about Drummond's word again. Foundational. It was the second week of April when Clifford Drummond called her directly. Not Marcus, her. Her personal cell, which she hadn't given him, which meant he'd found it through channels that suggested urgency. She answered on the third ring. She was in the car. Vivian. His voice had a different quality than it had at lunch, tighter, flatter. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it properly. She pulled to the curb. Go ahead. I got a call yesterday from someone named Preston Vale. He's at a firm called Vale Sorrento Partners. You know it? She did. She wished she didn't. Investment arm of the Sorrento Industrial Group, she said. They acquire IP from independent inventors and license it through their own entity structure. The inventors usually end up... She paused. They usually end up with much less than they expected. That's consistent with what I know about them, Drummond said. Preston Vale specifically approached me as someone who knew Hayes. He was asking about the Meridian research. How complete it was. What the IP situation looked like. A pause. He was asking in a way that suggested he already had a plan. He just wanted technical validation. Vivian's hand tightened on the phone. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know the current state of the work, and I didn't have any information about the IP structure. A beat. Which is mostly true. But Vivian, this firm, if they move on Hayes before his patents are fully registered, before he has representation, I know, she said. They're not like Croft. Croft is aggressive, but he's straight. Vale Sorrento has a history of positioning themselves into situations before the inventor understands what's happening, and then... He stopped. Hayes needs to know they're circling. She was already thinking, how did Vale know about the research? The patent filings. Same as Croft, same as anyone paying attention. But the difference is that Croft would negotiate in good faith. Vale will look for leverage. He lowered his voice slightly. He asked me if Hayes had any outstanding business debts, any litigation history, any property disputes that might affect his ownership claims. Vivian went very still. Property disputes. I don't know if he knows about your project, Drummond said, but if he does, and if he sees the pending acquisition pressure as a vulnerability, he'd use it as leverage against Hayes, she said, make him feel financially exposed and then offer to be the solution. That's my read. She sat on the side of the street with the engine running and the late afternoon light coming through the windshield at that particular angle that made everything look more serious than it did at other hours. She thought about a man in a kitchen saying, I'm not your enemy, Miss Sterling. She thought about a girl in a green hoodie eating toast on a front path. She thought about the way Hayes had sent technical notes to her project engineers without being asked, because it was the right thing to do. Thank you for telling me, Cliff, she said. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, she said, but I'm going to do something. She drove away from the curb and back toward the part of the city that made her most uncomfortable to think about at this particular moment. The part where her development project sat with its permits and its timelines and its footprint, that included, on its eastern edge, the address of a man who had just become, without either of them choosing it, someone she felt unexpectedly responsible for. She didn't examine that feeling too closely, but she didn't push it away either. She went back to Maplewood Street on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was doing something complicated with cloud cover and the temperature had climbed enough that the first real spring smells were coming up from the dirt. She didn't call ahead. She knocked on the door at 44. Lily answered it. Up close, and without the distance of a sidewalk between them, Lily Hayes was more specific than Vivian had registered before. The same dark hair as her father, but with a wideness to her brown eyes that suggested whoever her mother had been. She was eating an apple and holding a paperback book with one finger marking her place, and she looked at Vivian with an expression that was polite and completely, utterly frank. "You're the developer lady," she said. It wasn't hostile, just informational. "I am," Vivian said. "Is your dad home?" "He's in the garage." She considered this. "You can go around. He doesn't always hear the door from there." Vivian hesitated. She'd been asking herself for the length of the drive over how she was going to tell Hayes what Drummond had told her. How to explain that she had information about a threat to him that she'd only acquired because of her earlier efforts to understand his situation better, which had themselves begun as efforts to find a way to pressure him into selling. The situation was not uncomplicated, and she knew it. Lily was still watching her. "Is it about the house?" "Partly," Vivian said. "He's not selling," Lily said. Matter of fact, not angry. "In case you were going to ask again." "I know," Vivian said. "That's not actually why I'm here." Lily looked at her for another moment, that assessing child's gaze that registered things adults forgot to hide. "The garage is around the back," she said. "Follow the fence." Vivian followed the fence. She found the gate to the side driveway, went through it, and was walking toward the garage when she heard it. She stopped. Music. Coming from inside the garage, she could hear it faintly through the walls, something instrumental, with a low, deliberate bass line that had nothing and everything to do with the rusty exterior of the building. And under the music, another sound, a mechanical sound she couldn't immediately identify. Not banging, not grinding, but something more precise, measured. The sound of something being done very carefully. She stood outside the garage door for a moment. "You haven't seen the inside," he'd said, on the first day she'd come to this street. She hadn't, but she was standing close enough now to hear the sounds of whatever was in there, and they were nothing like she'd expected, and nothing like the building deserved. She raised her hand and knocked on the garage's side door, a smaller entry door she could see set into the wall beside the main roll-up, 3 times, waiting. The music stopped. A pause. Then the sound of something being set down carefully. Then footsteps. The door opened and Nolan Hayes stood in the gap with grease on his left forearm and a look of moderate surprise that settled into something quieter when he saw who it was. "Miss Sterling," he said. "I need to tell you something," she said. "It's not about the sale." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "You'd better come in," he said. And for the first time, Vivian Sterling stepped inside the garage she had once, without hesitation, called an eyesore. What she saw there stopped her completely. She didn't move for a full 5 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than she'd ever been genuinely stopped by anything in her professional life. She stood in the doorway with the cool April air at her back and looked at the interior of the garage she had mocked on the first day she'd come to Maplewood Street, and understood, with a quiet and absolute certainty, that she had made a very significant error. The garage was clean. That was the first thing that registered, and it registered wrong. The way a sound in the wrong room registers, the brain catching on the impossibility of it before the rest of the information arrives. Vivian had expected tools and disorder and the organized chaos of a working space. She had expected the interior to match the exterior the way most things do. It didn't. The floor was sealed concrete, gray and smooth and without a crack. the kind of surface you'd find in a medical facility or a precision manufacturing environment. Not showroom clean. There were oil patches near the central work bay and a layer of metal dust on the far workbench that had the look of something chronic rather than accidental, but deliberately, systematically clean. The kind of clean that was maintained not from habit, but from necessity, because the work required it. The walls were lined with racking that held components organized by a system only Hayes would fully understand. Some labeled in his handwriting, some in a shorthand she couldn't read, some with printed tags that included alphanumeric codes. 3 workbenches ran along the west wall, each with its own lighting. Not overhead fluorescent, but adjustable task lighting, the kind that could be positioned precisely. Tools hung on pegboard above the benches, each with a painted outline behind it so you could see at a glance what was missing. But none of that was what stopped her. What stopped her were the cars. There were 2 of them. They occupied the main floor space with the particular authority of objects that understood their own value. The first was a 1966 Shelby Cobra, finished in a dark, almost black navy blue that caught the garage lighting and held it differently at different angles. The second was something she didn't recognize immediately. Lower, longer, with lines that were too clean and too deliberate for anything she'd seen before. The Cobra was restored. She wasn't a car person, had never been, but she knew what she was looking at in the way you knew when you were looking at a painting that was worth more than the wall it hung on. Every surface was right. The proportions were right. Whatever Hayes had done to it, he'd done it with the kind of patience that couldn't be purchased. The other car was something different entirely. She walked toward it without really deciding to, the way you move toward something that pulls attention before the rest of you has caught up. It was wider than the Cobra, lower in the rear, with a body profile that was functional and deliberate and subtly wrong in the way that breakthrough designs were always wrong. Wrong because they were ahead, not behind. "That's not restored," she said. It came out flat, which wasn't what she intended. "No," Hayes said from behind her. He was leaning against the doorframe, still with the grease on his forearm, watching her with the measured attention of someone who'd waited a long time for a particular moment and wasn't sure yet what to feel about it. "What is it?" "My design," he said. "Start to finish. I built the body, I designed the drivetrain, I did the engineering on the propulsion system." He paused. "It's what I've been working on." She walked around the car slowly. From the rear, she could see that the exhaust configuration was unlike anything she'd seen on a production vehicle. Not absent, but minimal, 2 small ports set symmetrically into the lower body panel that looked almost apologetic about their own necessity. She didn't know enough to read what that meant technically, but she understood that it meant something. "It runs?" she said. "It runs." She looked up at him. "Have you tested it?" "Extensively." The word was flat and careful, and carried weight she couldn't fully measure. 12 months of testing, 67 documented test runs. I modified the drivetrain configuration 3 times during that period. He moved away from the door and came to stand across the car from her, looking down at it with the expression of someone who was past the point of being impressed by their own work and had arrived somewhere more complicated. "The efficiency numbers from the last test series are consistent enough that I'm confident in the core design." She looked at the car and then back at him. Drummond said foundational. Cliff saw the early stage documentation. He was generous with that word at the time. Hayes rested one hand on the car's roof, a gesture so casual and familiar it looked like touching a shoulder. "Whether the final system earns it is something other people will have to decide." "What do the numbers say?" He considered her for a long moment. She had the sense he was deciding how much of the wall to take down, and how fast, and whether the reasons were good enough. "The efficiency curve in the propulsion system is approximately 40% better than the best current production hybrid architecture," he said. "At high output, track-level performance, the gap is closer to 60. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, without ornamentation, without pride in the conventional sense, like he was reading from a table of facts. "The weight distribution is different from any current hybrid because the energy management system doesn't use a conventional battery stack. That's the part that took the longest. The battery architecture is integrated into the structural chassis members. It's not added weight, it's the structure." She stared at him. "The battery is part of the frame." "The energy storage is part of the frame," he corrected gently. "The distinction matters." She looked at the car again. She looked at the low rear, the minimal exhaust, the body lines that had seemed almost wrong and now seemed like they'd been inevitable. She thought about what Croft had said. Makes everything currently on the market look like it was designed in the previous century. She thought about what she'd said dismissively to Marcus that first morning on the street, standing in front of a rusted roll-up door. That building is an eyesore. She felt something she didn't encounter often. Not quite shame, she wasn't there yet, but the particular discomfort of realizing you had assigned something of value without looking at it. "I mocked this garage," she said. She didn't soften it. Hayes looked at her. "You did. Standing right outside it. The first morning I came to this street. I heard you." He said it without heat. "I figured you'd come around." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're not stupid. And stupid is the only reason someone stays wrong about something once the information is available." He moved away from the car and toward the workbench along the west wall, and she followed because it seemed like the right thing to do. "You wanted to come tell me something. You said it wasn't about the sale." She'd almost forgotten. The car, the clean concrete floor, the organized racking. It had pushed Drummond's call briefly to the back of her mind. She brought it forward. "Someone named Preston Vale," she said. "Do you know the name?" Hayes was at the workbench, picking up a tool she didn't recognize and setting it down again with the automatic tidiness of someone doing it without thinking. He went still when she said the name. "I know the firm," he said carefully. "Vale Sorrento. They've been making inquiries about the Meridian research, about the IP structure, about whether there are any property disputes or financial pressures that might affect ownership claims." She watched him. "Drummond called me yesterday. Vale contacted him looking for technical validation." Hayes set the tool down and didn't pick up another one. He stood at the workbench with his back partially to her, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working. "When?" he said. "Drummond got the call 3 days ago." He turned around. His expression had changed. Not panicked, but the levelness had a different quality now. The levelness of someone actively maintaining it rather than someone who was naturally there. What exactly did Vale ask him? She told him. All of it. The questions about outstanding debts, litigation history, property disputes. Hayes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that the refrigeration unit somewhere in the garage clicked on and the sound filled the space around them. "He knows about the development project," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. "That's my guess. It's public record. Same as the patent filings. If he connected the two, he's looking for a pressure point," Hayes said. "Something to make me feel like I'm running out of road, so I'll take whatever he puts in front of me." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite a question. He'd positioned himself as the solution to a problem he helped create. "That's their pattern," she said. "I know their pattern." He said it quietly. "I had a lawyer review Val Sorrento's public licensing history when I first started filing. I know what they do to independent inventors who don't have the structure to protect themselves." A pause. "I've been building that structure for 3 years. Quietly." She looked at him. "What kind of structure?" He picked up a rag from the workbench and wiped the grease from his forearm slowly, working at the crease of his wrist where it had gotten under the skin. "Patent filings through a dedicated IP holding entity, separate from the operating company. 3 years of test documentation time-stamped and filed with a third-party verification service. All contractual records from Meridian stored redundantly with 2 different attorneys." He paused. "I'm not naive about what this work is worth. I've been building the defenses since before the work was close to finished." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "You've been doing this alone," she said. "Yes. For 6 years. For 6 years. But..." She didn't say what she was thinking, that the weight of that must have been enormous, the specific loneliness of having something important and having to protect it and develop it and raise a daughter at the same time, in a rusted garage on a street nobody paid attention to. She didn't say it because he hadn't brought it up, and it wasn't her place, and she understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that he wouldn't want the acknowledgement. He'd done what he'd done because it was what needed doing. That was all. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. He wasn't being suspicious. He was asking genuinely. "You didn't need to come here. Vale's move, whatever it is, doesn't directly help your project." She thought about that. She thought about what the real answer was and whether she was going to give it to him. Because you sent technical notes to my project engineers, she said finally, when you had no reason to. Because you told me the water table problem was fixable, even though fixing it helped my project and not yours. She met his eyes. Because I've spent 3 months approaching you like an obstacle, and you've spent 3 months being straightforwardly decent, and I owed you something. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not soft exactly, but less defended. Okay, he said quietly. Is there anything you need? From me, specifically. Not the company. Me. Mom. He was quiet for a beat. Not right now. He looked around the garage, at the Cobra, at the prototype, at the years of work on the walls. I need to talk to my attorney. I need to understand exactly what Vale knows and when he knew it. He looked back at her. But I appreciate the information. Genuinely. She nodded. She looked at the prototype one more time, the car that had been built in secret, in a building she had dismissed without looking at, on a street she had been trying to erase. It's remarkable, she said. She meant the car. She might have meant more than that. It's close, he said. Not done, but close. She left the garage and walked back up the side drive to the street. Lily was sitting on the front porch steps now, with the paperback book open in her lap, apparently not reading it. She watched Vivian come through the gate with that frank, evaluating look. Did you go inside? Lily said. Yes. First time anybody did? Lily said. Then she looked back at her book. Vivian walked to her car and sat in it for a full minute before starting the engine. She looked at the house, the vinyl siding, the maple tree, the front porch where a 12-year-old was sitting with a book she wasn't reading. She looked at the garage beyond it, the rusty exterior she'd called an eyesore on a street she'd come to demolish. She thought about the clean concrete floor, the organized racking, the car that didn't look like any other car. She thought about Lily saying, first time anybody did, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting a fact that didn't particularly wound them but existed nonetheless. She started the car and drove toward the office, and spent the drive not thinking about the development project. But the thing about Preston Vale was that he moved fast when he decided to move. Drummond's warning had come on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Hayes had an attorney on notice and his IP holding documents had been reviewed and confirmed sound. By Friday morning, a certified letter arrived at the registered address of Hayes Mechanical Solutions from Vale Sorrento Partners, which Vivian knew because Hayes called her. She answered on the first ring, which she noticed. They sent an offer letter, he said. His voice was even, but differently even than usual. The kind of even that was being maintained against some other force. An unsolicited acquisition offer for the full IP portfolio of Hayes Mechanical Solutions. The number is... He paused. It's designed to look significant to someone who doesn't understand what they have. What's the number? 8 million. She closed her eyes for a second. It's a fraction, he said. I know that. The letter also includes language about the offer's validity period, 72 hours, and a paragraph about the current uncertainty in the IP landscape due to pending development pressures in the property's geographic area. A pause. That last part is their use of your project as leverage. I know, she said. I'm sorry. It's not your doing. He was quiet for a moment. I've already forwarded it to my attorney. The 72-hour window is a pressure tactic. The offer isn't binding in any way that would prevent them from making another one, and I'm not required to respond. What are you going to do? Nothing yet, he said. Wait, let the window close. Make sure my documentation is current and complete. Another pause. My attorney says if they escalate to any kind of legal challenge to the IP ownership, the documentation I have is sufficient. She's seen it. She's confident. Vivian stood at her office window with the city laid out below her in its vast, impersonal geometry. What if they go a different direction? Not legal. Pressure through the development project. What do you mean? Vale Sorrento isn't just a capital firm. They have relationships with development and commercial interests. If someone at a senior enough level decided to... She stopped. She was thinking through something that hadn't fully formed yet. If they approached my project's financing partners with information about the Hayes property representing a title complication, could they do that? She thought about it. The answer was yes and no. They couldn't manufacture a title complication where there wasn't one, but they could make noise. They could create the impression of uncertainty around the property, and in development finance, the impression of uncertainty had real consequences. I'd need to get ahead of it, she said. Talk to my financing partners directly. Make sure there's no opening for that kind of interference. Why would you do that? He asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. That protects me. It doesn't help your project. It prevents your situation from being used as a weapon, she said. That matters to me. He was quiet long enough that she could hear him breathing on the other end. Vivian, he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. It landed differently than she expected. Yeah. I want to show you something, he said. In the garage, not the cars, the engineering documentation, the test data. A pause. I've been thinking about what I said about not answering questions about the work to someone in real estate. I think I was using that as a wall. You were entitled to the wall. I know, he said, but I think... He stopped. Come by on Saturday. Bring coffee, because mine is terrible. She almost smiled. What time? 9. I'll be there. Saturday. She brought coffee from the place 2 blocks away, the same place she'd gotten it from on that first Monday she'd come back to the street, and she went through the side gate and knocked on the small door set into the garage wall. He opened it faster than she expected, like he'd been close. He looked different on a Saturday morning, or maybe she was just looking at him differently now. He'd shaved, which was a small thing, but she noticed it. He had a flannel shirt over a thermal layer that had probably been washed too many times to have a color anymore. He looked tired in the way that people who did sustained, serious work looked tired. Not depleted, but carrying something. He took the coffee she handed him with a nod and stepped back to let her in. The garage was the same as it had been on Tuesday. The clean floor, the organized walls, the 2 cars in the main space. But today there were papers on the central workbench, spread in a deliberate arrangement. She could see what looked like engineering diagrams and tables of figures and something that was clearly a test log. Sit, he said, gesturing toward a wooden stool at the end of the bench. She sat. He stood across from her with his coffee and looked down at the papers. What I'm going to show you isn't proprietary, he said. The specific numbers aren't in any public filing. But the structural concept is, so this isn't, I'm not handing you anything you could use against me. I'm not here to use things against you. He looked at her. I know that now. He said it simply, without ceremony. That's why I'm doing this. He walked her through it. She wasn't an engineer, she'd been clear with herself about that, and she was clear with him. But she understood systems, the flow of resources, the architecture of complex interdependent structures, the way a change in one component propagated through everything else. What Hayes had done, translated into the language she understood, was redesign the relationship between energy storage and energy output at a fundamental level. He hadn't optimized the existing approach. He'd replaced its assumptions. He was not a natural explainer. He had to backtrack twice, catch himself using terms she didn't have, find different language. At one point he picked up a pen and drew something on a scrap of paper, a diagram that was rough and slightly crooked and effective, and pushed it across the workbench to her. She studied it and asked a question, and he answered it and asked if that made sense, and she said mostly, and he tried again. It took almost 2 hours. By the end, she understood enough to understand what she hadn't understood before. The gap between what existed and what he'd built, as best she could translate it, was not incremental. You couldn't look at it as a percentage improvement in current technology, the way you could look at most engineering advances. It was closer to looking at 2 different theories of how the thing should fundamentally work. The industry has been trying to solve the weight efficiency problem in high-performance hybrids by improving battery technology, he said, near the end of the 2 hours. Making the battery better, lighter, denser, faster to charge. He gestured at the diagram on the scrap paper. I solved it by making the battery structural. If the energy storage is also the skeleton of the car, it's not additional weight. It's the weight that was already there, doing a second job. Mutt. She looked at the diagram, then at the prototype car in the bay. Every manufacturer in the world who makes high-performance vehicles would want this. Yes, and you own it. Completely, he said. Every claim, every component design, every test result. My attorney has reviewed the chain of ownership 3 times. She turned on the stool and looked at the car. The one he'd built, the lines she'd spent a Tuesday walking around, the exhaust ports that looked apologetic about themselves. She looked at it and thought about the $8 million offer in the certified letter, and she thought about the actual value of what was sitting in front of her, and the gap between those 2 numbers was wide enough to lose things in. Vale knows what this is worth, she said. Of course he does. That's why the offer is what it is. He's betting you either don't know or don't have the protection. He's wrong on both, Hayes said, but he's going to find that out the slow way because he's not used to being wrong. She looked at him. What's the plan for taking it to market? He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold, she guessed, but he drank it anyway. Licensing. I'm not interested in manufacturing. I want to license the architecture to multiple manufacturers under terms that let me retain the core patents. My attorney has a contact at a firm that specializes in this kind of structure. He paused. Croft reached out again last week. The day after Vale's letter, actually. What did you tell him? I told him I'd be ready to have a real conversation within 60 days. 60 days? She said. The remaining test documentation needs to be complete and filed. The final patent applications need to go in. He set down the coffee. 60 days is accurate. She sat on the stool in his garage on a Saturday morning in mid-April with the spring light coming in through the high window he'd covered from the inside. The paper was gone, she noticed, replaced with a translucent film that let in diffuse light without allowing visibility in either direction. And she thought about what the next 60 days looked like from his side and from hers. On her side, a development project with 2 unsigned properties, a financing timeline that was beginning to feel pressure, and a partner firm that had become inconveniently entangled in a situation it hadn't created. On his side, 60 days of work standing between him and something he'd spent 6 years building toward, with a predatory capital firm circling and a development project bearing down on his street, and a 12-year-old daughter who'd eaten toast on a porch path and told a developer her dad wasn't selling without any particular heat in it. My business partner, she said slowly. He looked up. Desmond Hale. He co-owns the Maplewood project with me. The equity is split. He holds 40%. She stopped, not sure yet where she was going with this. What about him? He's more aggressive than I am, she said, which was an understatement, and she knew Hayes would sense it. He sees the 2 unsigned properties as problems to be solved, and he's been pushing for a different approach than I've been taking. She paused. If he finds out what's in this garage before you're ready, if Vale talks to him, or if Croft does, why would they? Because Desmond has capital relationships with both firms. He's been in this market longer than I have. He's connected. She looked at Hayes directly. He would see your work as an asset to acquire, not because he'd try to steal it, that's not his style, but because he'd see the leverage in it. He'd try to use it as pressure to get the property. And he's good at pressure. Hayes was quiet, watching her. I'm telling you because you told me about the water table, she said, because that's apparently how we're doing this now. He nodded slowly. Okay. Be careful about who reaches out to you in the next 60 days, she said. Anyone with a connection to the development finance world, verify who they're actually working for before you talk to them. Not because they'd all be acting in bad faith, but because the information doesn't stay contained the way you might expect. Understood. She stood from the stool. Her back was stiff from the wooden seat, and she straightened it with less grace than she'd have preferred. One more thing, she said. The cobra. He raised an eyebrow. Where did it come from? Something crossed his face, a complicated passage of something she couldn't fully name. He looked at the car. It was my father's, he said. He started the restoration in 1987 and never finished it. He died when I was 19. A pause. I finished it here. It took me 4 years, in between everything else. She looked at the navy blue Cobra in the clean garage light. She thought about a man starting something he didn't finish, and a son finishing it years later in a garage on a street that someone was trying to take away from him. She didn't say anything about it. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't diminish it. Saturday, she said. I'm glad I came. So am I, he said, and he said it like he meant it. She went back through the side door, through the gate, up the front path past Lily's maple tree, which had gone from small green buds to actual leaves in the time that had passed since March. Small and young leaves, pale green, not their full summer weight yet, but unmistakably there. She got in her car. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. She looked at the message and felt the particular quality of timing that the world sometimes had, the way bad news didn't wait for convenient moments. Desmond wants a call. Today. Says he has new information about the Hayes property and wants to discuss accelerating the acquisition approach. She stared at the text for a long moment. Then she put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. And as she drove, she was already composing in her head what she was going to say to Desmond Hale, a man she'd worked with for 9 years and knew extremely well, when he told her what new information he had and where it had come from. Because she already knew, with a cold and settling certainty, that whatever Desmond had found out, the source of it was Preston Vale. And if Vale had reached Desmond before Hayes was ready, the 60 days Hayes needed had just gotten considerably more complicated. Desmond Hale's office occupied the corner of the 14th floor of a building he'd bought and refinanced twice, which was the kind of detail he mentioned enough that it had stopped registering as information and become something closer to ambient noise. He was 53, broad through the shoulders in the way that suggested he'd been athletic once, and had since redirected that energy into sitting across tables from people and outlasting them. He had the particular confidence of a man who had been right often enough that being wrong felt like a clerical error rather than a judgment about him. Vivian had known him for 9 years. She knew his tells. He was already standing when she came in, which meant he'd been waiting, which meant he was more energized about whatever he had than his text had let on. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and there was a legal pad on his desk with handwriting on it that she could see from the doorway was dense and underlined in several places. "Close the door," he said. She closed it and sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited to, which was something she'd learned to do in their partnership because waiting to be invited handed him an authority she wasn't interested in conceding. "Preston Vale," he said. "I know," she said. He stopped. That hadn't been what he'd expected. "You know." He approached Drummond 3 weeks ago. Drummond called me. I've been aware of Vale's interest in the Hayes situation since then. She kept her voice level. "What did Vale tell you?" Desmond sat down slowly, recalibrating. He picked up his pen and turned it in his fingers. "He called me Thursday. Said he'd been doing due diligence on an IP acquisition target whose property overlapped with the development zone he'd identified as ours. Said the target had a significant technology asset that was underprotected and that there might be an opportunity to use the property acquisition pressure as a coordination point." He paused. His word. Coordination. What did he mean by coordination? He meant that if we accelerate the acquisition timeline on the Hayes property, push it harder, create real legal and financial pressure, Hayes might become receptive to a deal structure that Vale controls. And Vale would cut us in on the IP licensing revenue as a courtesy for our participation. Vivian looked at him. He wants us to be the hammer, so he can be the one who shows up with the solution. That's about right. And your read on that? Desmond set the pen down. My read is that the technology is real if Vale is this interested. Vale doesn't chase things that aren't real. And my read is that if it's real, the value is significant enough that a piece of a licensing deal is worth more than the Hayes property footprint on its own. He met her eyes. So I want to know what you know, because you clearly know more than you've been telling me. She'd been preparing for this conversation in the car. She'd played it out 3 or 4 different ways, how much to say, how to say it, what Desmond's response to each version would be. He was not a bad person. She'd been clear with herself about that throughout. He was a person who operated within a particular logic, and that logic was about value identification and extraction, and it had served them both well for 9 years. And right now it was pointed directly at Nolan Hayes in a way that Vivian found she could not be neutral about. The technology is real, she said. I've been inside the garage. I've seen the prototype and reviewed a significant portion of the test documentation. She watched Desmond's face change and didn't stop. It's a revolutionary hybrid propulsion architecture. The efficiency numbers are legitimate, and they're unlike anything currently in production. The IP is clean, fully documented, properly structured in a holding entity that he set up specifically to protect against the kind of approach Vale is describing. Hayes has been building his legal protection for 3 years. His attorney has reviewed the ownership chain and is confident. Desmond was very still. You went inside the garage? Several times. And you didn't tell me. I was developing my understanding of the situation, she said, which is what I do. He looked at her with something that had irritation in it and respect in it, and neither one winning cleanly. What else? Hayes is 60 days from being ready to bring this to market. He has an existing relationship with Clifford Drummond from Meridian and a pending conversation with Randall Croft at Croft Ellison Capital. He doesn't need Vale, and he doesn't need us. He's been preparing for this moment for 6 years, and the preparation is thorough. 60 days, Desmond said slowly. In 60 days, Vale's leverage disappears. The patents are complete, the test documentation is filed, and Hayes walks into a licensing conversation with Croft from a position of complete strength. At that point, there's nothing Vale can threaten and nothing we can use as pressure. She paused. Which is why Vale called you now. Desmond looked at the legal pad. He looked at the underlined notes he'd made before she arrived, the architecture of the plan Vale had proposed, and she could see him reassessing it against everything she'd just said. If Hayes is as protected as you're describing, he said slowly, then the coordination play Vale described doesn't actually work. It doesn't. So Vale is either overstating his leverage or he doesn't know how protected Hayes is. Both probably, she said. He knows about the IP broadly. He doesn't know about the documentation structure or the holding entity or the attorney Hayes has been working with. He's treating Hayes like an unprotected independent inventor because that's what the profile looks like from outside. Desmond leaned back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. And you're telling me this because I need you to turn Vale down, she said. Clearly, not ambiguously. Tell him we're not in the business of coordinating property pressure against individual homeowners to benefit a third-party IP acquisition. He looked at her. That's not how you usually frame things. I know, she said. We've used development pressure before, as a negotiating tool. I know we have. So what's different now? She thought about how to answer that honestly. She'd been asking herself the same question for several days, and the answer she kept arriving at was specific and not entirely comfortable. What's different is that I understand what he's built, she said. And I understand who he is. And using our project as a club to beat him into a predatory deal with a firm that will take the majority of the value of 6 years of work from a man who has spent those 6 years also raising his daughter alone. She stopped. I'm not willing to be part of that structure. Desmond studied her. He'd known her 9 years. He knew when she'd made a decision versus when she was still deciding. This isn't just about the ethics, he said. It wasn't an accusation. No, she said. It's not just that. You like him? She didn't answer immediately. I respect him, she said, which is different. But yes, there's something else in there, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise because you'd see through it anyway. He sat forward again and put his hands on the desk. This was his thinking posture. She knew it well. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll call Vale? Okay, I'll call Vale and decline. He picked up the pen again. But I want something in return. She waited. The Hayes property, he said. When he completes the licensing deal and the financial picture changes, which it will, significantly, I want you to approach him again. Not with pressure. With something that actually works for him. He tapped the legal pad. The project design can flex. It's not ideal, but we can work around the 44 footprint if we have to. I'd rather have the goodwill of a man who's about to be very, very wealthy and very, very well connected in the automotive space. She looked at him. That's surprisingly practical. I'm always practical, he said, slightly offended. I'm just usually practical in a different direction. He set the pen down. Call me when he's signed with Croft. We'll figure out the rest then. She drove back to her office thinking about the gap between who Desmond was and who she'd been afraid he'd decided to be. It was a gap she'd known about and chosen to forget for the duration of that conversation, and she wasn't proud of that. She called Hayes from the parking garage. Vale is going to get a call from my partner today or tomorrow, she said when he picked up, declining their coordination proposal. You don't need to do anything with that. I just wanted you to know. A pause. You talked to Hale. This afternoon. And he agreed. After some discussion. Yes. Another pause, longer. You went to bat for me with your business partner. I did. He was quiet long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then, thank you. You're welcome, she said. Stay the course. 60 days. Working on it, he said. The 60 days didn't go smoothly. She hadn't expected them to. Vale didn't go quietly after Desmond's call. He moved sideways the way people who were used to winning did when a direct approach got closed off. He started making noise in the financing community, suggesting in the careful, deniable language of professional gossip that the Hayes EP situation had unresolved provenance questions. Nothing specific enough to act on, just enough to make certain kinds of ears perk up and certain kinds of calls happen. Two of the Sterling Group's secondary financing partners called Marcus within the same week with versions of the same question. Had the Maplewood project team assessed the potential complications related to a contested intellectual property situation on one of the unsigned properties? Vivian handled both calls herself. There is no contested IP situation, she told the first one. A fund manager named Garrett, who'd been in the business long enough to know the difference between a real complication and a manufactured one. There is an independent inventor on one unsigned property who is in the process of completing a significant technology licensing process. His IP ownership is not in dispute. A third-party capital firm is circulating misinformation because they failed to acquire his work. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Well, Sorrento, I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He sounded almost amused. We've seen this play before, Vivian. Don't worry about it on our end. The second call was less pleasant. The contact was a managing director at a larger institutional fund who was newer to their relationship with Sterling Group and less experienced with the particular games of the development finance world. She spent 45 minutes on the phone with him explaining the actual situation in enough technical and legal detail that by the end of the call he sounded slightly stunned. We weren't aware of the scope of the technology, he said at one point. Most people aren't, she said. That's by design. The inventor has been extremely private about the work. Is there a way for our fund, from an investment positioning standpoint? No, she said, gently but completely. It's not structured for that. But the Maplewood project itself is sound. The Hayes footprint is a single unsigned property in a 17-property block. Our construction timeline can accommodate a modified design. That's the investment you made, and it's the investment that's real. By the end of the week, the noise Vale had created had mostly been addressed. But noise had a way of doing some damage before it was corrected, and Vivian knew that. She knew it when she went into the following Monday's project meeting and found Desmond quieter than usual, and she knew it when Marcus came into her office on Tuesday with an expression that preceded difficult information. Vale filed, he said. She looked up. Filed what? He handed her a document. She read the first page and understood it within 30 seconds. He's challenging the IP ownership. Not directly, Marcus said, sitting across from her. He's filed a petition with the Patent Office alleging that a portion of the Hayes foundational patent claims overlap with proprietary research developed at Meridian Technologies, and that Hayes's employment contract at the time did not adequately separate the relevant work. He paused. It's a procedural challenge. It doesn't invalidate the patents. It triggers a review process. She read the filing more carefully. The language was precise and densely technical, and she didn't understand all of it, but she understood the architecture. Vale had found a seam, or manufactured the appearance of one, in the documentation of Hayes's time at Meridian, and he was using it to introduce uncertainty into the ownership chain. It's a delay tactic, she said. If the review process takes 6 months, Hayes's negotiating position with Croft degrades. Croft won't sign a licensing deal on IP with an active ownership challenge. That's the play, Marcus said. Create enough procedural uncertainty that Hayes either accepts a bad deal to make it go away or loses the timing advantage he's spent years building. She put the filing down on her desk. She felt something she didn't often feel in a professional context, a specific and unambiguous anger that settled cold rather than hot. She called Hayes. He'd already seen it. His attorney had called him an hour before Marcus had walked into Vivian's office. and his voice when he answered her call had that controlled quality she recognized from when he was working hardest to sound steady. "How bad is it?" she said. "It's not good," he said. "My attorney says the substantive claim is weak. The documentation of the separation between my Meridian work and my personal research is thorough, and the timestamps are airtight. But the review process is real. It could take 4 to 8 months. And Croft?" A beat. "I called him this morning. He was measured. He said he couldn't proceed with active ownership questions on record. He said he'd revisit once the review was resolved." Another beat. "He was kind about it. That almost made it worse." She sat in her office with the filing on her desk, and the city outside doing what cities did, moving, building, tearing down, building again. And she thought about the particular cruelty of the timing. 60 days had become 4 to 8 months in a morning. "What does your attorney need to fight this?" she said. "The core documentation I have is sufficient," he said. "But she's going to want supporting testimony, someone with direct knowledge of what I was and wasn't doing at Meridian during the relevant period who can corroborate the separation." He paused. "Drummond is the obvious choice, but Drummond has a conflict now. He's technically employed by the company that acquired Meridian, and if they're connected to Vail, are they? My attorney is finding out. If there's any relationship between the acquiring company and Vail Sorrento, Drummond testifying becomes complicated for him professionally." She thought about Drummond, about the lunch in the Deep Booth restaurant, the way he'd described Hayes, the best engineer I ever worked with that particular quality of saying something you believed completely, even though it cost you something to say it. "Let me make a call," she said. "Vivian, let me make a call," she said again. "Give me until tomorrow morning." She called Drummond at 4:30 in the afternoon. He answered on the second ring. She explained the filing. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he'd already heard about it. "Vail move," he said when she finished. "Classic Vail move." "Hayes needs corroborating testimony," she said. "Someone with first-hand knowledge of the Meridian separation. You're the most credible option." Silence. "I know about the conflict," she said. "I know what it could cost you." "I'm retired," he said. After a moment, "My pension is vested. They can't take that back." He said it like he was thinking out loud. "And I have an employment attorney I've used before." "Cliff, I was there," he said. "I know what he was working on and when. I saw the documentation at the time. The separation was real and it was meticulous, and anybody who says otherwise is either wrong or lying." He stopped. "If Vail is going to claim that Nolan didn't own his own work, then somebody who was actually in the room needs to say that's not true. It could get complicated. I'm 61 years old, and I just spent 3 months in Florida. Complicated sounds fine." A pause. "Give my number to his attorney. Tell her I'll make myself available." She put the phone down and sat in her office until the city outside went from afternoon to evening, the light changing through her windows the way it did on clear April days when the sun got low and golden before it gave up entirely. She called Hayes back. "Drummond's in," she said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she almost spoke again. "He's going to take the conflict risk," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. He said the separation was real and he was in the room and somebody needed to say so. Another silence. Shorter this time. "He doesn't owe me that." "I know," she said. "He's doing it anyway." She heard Hayes exhale, a short, controlled sound that was the closest she'd heard him come to something not quite composed. "Okay," he said. Quiet. "Okay," she said. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of May. It was a patent office proceeding, not a courtroom, a conference room in a federal building downtown with a hearing officer and 2 administrative reviewers and a table at each end for the respective parties. Vivian attended as a fact witness at Hayes' attorney's request. She'd been present for enough of the surrounding circumstances to be useful in establishing the timeline of Vail's approach and the nature of the pressure applied. She sat in the hallway outside the conference room for 40 minutes before it started, waiting with Hayes and his attorney, a compact woman named Sandra Park, who had a reputation in IP law circles that Vivian had verified thoroughly the week before and found reassuring. Hayes was in a suit. She'd never seen him in a suit. It fit like it had been bought for an occasion he'd anticipated but hadn't looked forward to, and he'd managed to pick a tie that was almost right. He sat in the hallway chair with his hands on his knees and his notebook in his jacket pocket, the same battered notebook she'd first seen in his driveway 4 months ago. "How are you doing?" she asked. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not fine." He looked at her. "I'm managing," he said, "which is close enough." Sandra Park sat on his other side with a tablet and her own notebook, and the particular stillness of someone who'd done this enough times that the anxiety was technical rather than personal. "The filing is weak," Sandra said, without looking up. "Vale's position is based on a misreading of the employment contract language, and he knows it. The question is whether the hearing officer reads it the same way." She did look up then. "The documentation Nolan has is thorough enough that the separation argument should be obvious. But obvious and officially decided are different things, and that's what today is for." Vale's team arrived 10 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. There were 3 of them. Vale himself, a tall man with expensive posture, and the kind of face that had learned to project certainty as a default. His attorney, who was senior enough to be unhurried, and a technical consultant who carried a briefcase that suggested documentation. Vale made eye contact with Hayes briefly, crossing the hallway. There was an assessment in it. Hayes held it without expression and looked away first only because he chose to, which was a small thing, but Vivian registered it. "Mr. Hayes," Vale said. He stopped in the hallway, which she guessed he'd planned. "I want you to know this isn't personal." Hayes looked at him. "I know it isn't," he said. "It's strategic. You don't need me to be upset about that." Something flicked across Vale's face. He nodded once and went into the conference room. Sandra watched the door close. "Good," she said quietly to Hayes. "Keep that." The hearing ran 4 hours. Vivian was called in the second hour and testified for 30 minutes about the timeline of Vale Sorrento's approach to both Drummond and Desmond Hale, the nature of the pressure applied, and the sequence of events that had preceded the patent filing. She answered the questions she was asked clearly and didn't elaborate beyond them. And when Vale's attorney tried to frame her involvement as representative of a conflicted interest, the developer who wanted Hayes's property, she said simply, "I've recommended to my partner that we redesign the project to accommodate the Hayes property permanently. I'm not here because I want his property. I'm here because I was present for the events in question." Vale's attorney let that sit and moved on. Drummond testified in the 3rd hour. He'd driven up from wherever he'd been, which she guessed was not Florida, and he looked like a man who'd slept in the car and didn't care. He testified for 50 minutes about the employment agreement, about what Hayes had been working on during his time at Meridian and what he'd been working on personally, about the documentation Hayes had maintained during the separation period, and the fact that Drummond himself had reviewed portions of it at the time. "Were there ever any questions internally at Meridian about whether Hayes's personal research overlapped with company IP?" the hearing officer asked. "The legal department reviewed his agreement when he resigned and identified no valid claim," Drummond said. "They closed the question." "And the current petitions claim that the foundational architecture overlaps with Meridian proprietary research." Drummond looked at Vale's table and back at the hearing officer. "The foundational architecture in Hayes's patents is not Meridian's research. I know what Meridian's research looked like. I ran the department. What Nolan built is different in kind, not just in degree. It's a different solution to a different framing of the problem." He paused. "If you want to claim that someone who worked at a company and then left that company and then built something revolutionary in his own garage must have stolen it from the company, then you're saying that engineers don't get to be brilliant on their own time. I'm telling you, that's wrong, and I was there." The conference room was quiet after that. Hayes's attorney presented the documentation in the 4th hour. The time-stamped records, the third-party verification filings, the employment agreement annotations, the separation log Hayes had maintained during his final 18 months at Meridian. The hearing officer reviewed it with the 2 administrative reviewers in a quiet, thorough way that felt almost academic. Vale's technical consultant presented a counter-analysis that challenged the architecture classification. Sandra Park dismantled it in 12 minutes, using language precise enough that even Vivian, sitting in her observer's chair, could follow the places where the consultant's analysis failed. At 4:17 in the afternoon, the hearing officer said he would issue a written determination within 30 days, but indicated that based on the documentation presented, The petitioner's claim appeared to have a significant evidentiary burden it had not met. In legal language, that was close to a verdict. They came out of the conference room into the federal building hallway, and it was brighter than the room had been and louder, other people moving through the corridor on their own business. Sandra Park was already on her phone. Drummond was talking to Hayes in a low voice, and Hayes was listening with his head slightly down and his hands in his jacket pockets. Vivian stood to one side and waited. When Drummond finished what he was saying, Hayes shook his hand, a real handshake, held a beat longer than formal. Drummond clapped him on the shoulder once and walked away down the corridor, already pulling out his phone. Hayes came and stood next to Vivian. "He drove up from Savannah," Hayes said. "He said he'd moved to Savannah in January. That's a 10-hour drive," she said. 8.5 the way he drives. Something almost like a smile. "He wouldn't let me pay for the hotel. Said he had points." They stood in the corridor for a moment with the sound of the building around them. "Sandra says 30 days for the written determination," he said. "She thinks it'll be sooner." The hearing officer's comment at the end was as close to a ruling as he could give without it being official. "I heard it the same way." "Croft called while I was in the hallway during Drummond's testimony," Hayes said. "I didn't answer, obviously, but he left a message." He looked at her. "He said he'd been following the proceeding status. It's a public filing. And that he wanted to schedule the conversation we'd been deferring for as soon as I was ready." 60 days turned into 6 weeks, she said. "It did. A beat. Things don't always go the way you plan." "No," she said. "They don't." He looked at her with the level, considering expression she'd come to recognize as him actually thinking rather than thinking about what to say. "You put Drummond in front of me," he said, "and you went to Hale, and you handled the financing noise." He paused. "I built the work and I built the protection, but the last 6 weeks, you would have gotten through it," she said. "Maybe. Differently." He looked down the corridor where Drummond had gone. "I've been alone on this for a long time, not by accident. I needed it that way, I think. But there were moments in the last 6 weeks where—" He stopped. He seemed to be deciding whether to continue. "Where it helped. Having someone who knew." She looked at him. "Yeah," she said. "It did." He nodded once. It was the kind of nod that closed something and opened something else simultaneously, though neither of them said what either thing was. "I need to pick up Lily," he said. He looked at his watch. "She's at Eleanor Whitmore's house. Eleanor's been watching her on hearing days because Lily's school lets out at 3. Vivian blinked. "Eleanor Whitmore is watching your daughter." "Eleanor has watched Lily on and off since she was 7, he said, with the mildly amused expression of someone delivering a fact they knew would land strangely. "They play cards. Eleanor cheats." He picked up his jacket from the bench. "Lily's figured it out and lets her do it anyway." She stood in the federal building corridor and watched Nolan Hayes put his jacket on and straighten the tie that was almost right. And she thought about Eleanor Whitmore, who wanted to die in her house playing cards with a 12-year-old and cheating. And she thought about the Cobra in the garage and the Savannah Hotel that Drummond had paid for with points. And she thought about all the things that happened in the spaces between the narrative she'd constructed about Maplewood Street when she'd stood there in a red dress on a March morning and called a garage an eyesore. "Vivian," he said. She looked at him. "Come to dinner," he said. "Not tonight. Lily has a project due tomorrow, and she hasn't started it, which is something I found out this morning." A flicker of parental exasperation crossed his face and made him look briefly and completely human. "Saturday? I'll cook something. Lily will interrogate you about your job, and I apologize in advance." She thought about saying she had plans. She didn't have plans. "What time?" she said. 6, he said. "Bring nothing. Lily will tell you to bring dessert, but she's trying to manipulate you." She watched him walk down the corridor and push through the building's glass doors into the late May afternoon. And the light outside was the particular quality of late spring in the city, when everything was green and the days were long enough to still have brightness at 5 o'clock. And for the first time in a long time, Vivian Sterling stood somewhere without already calculating what the space was worth. She just stood there. And it was enough. The written determination came in 19 days, not 30. Sandra Park called Hayes on a Thursday morning at 8:42, and he called Vivian at 8:44, which told her something about the order of things in his life that she didn't examine too closely, but noticed. "It's done," he said. "Full dismissal." The hearing officer found that the petitioner failed to establish a credible evidentiary basis for the ownership challenge. The language is, Sandra says it's unusually direct. He essentially said Vale's claim was not supported by the documentation and that the Hayes IP holding structure demonstrated thorough and consistent ownership throughout the development period. She was in the back of a car heading to a morning meeting, and she asked the driver to pull over, which she'd never done before for a phone call. "Nolan," she said. "Yeah." "Congratulations." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had something real in it. "Thank you," he said, "for everything that led to this." "You built it," she said. "I just made some phone calls." "You made the right phone calls at the right time," he said. "Don't undersell that." She looked out the window at the street, a different street from Maplewood, somewhere in the middle of the city, unremarkable. "Call Croft," she said. "Today." "Already on my list," he said. She could hear something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not relief exactly, because Hayes wasn't built to collapse into relief. Something lighter than his usual register, like a tension that had been so constant it had become ambient, had finally incrementally begun to release. "Saturday's still on, by the way, 6 o'clock. Lily asked me twice this morning whether you were actually coming." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you said yes, and you didn't seem like someone who said things she didn't mean." She looked at her hands in her lap. "That's accurate," she said. "I figured." A beat. 6 o'clock. She told the driver to continue and sat back in the seat and watched the city move past the window and thought about what done actually meant after 6 years of something that had never been done. And she thought it probably meant something different to Hayes than it did to her, and that the difference was worth respecting. Saturday arrived the way late May. Saturdays sometimes do in that part of the country. Warm in the sun and cool in the shade. The kind of evening that couldn't fully decide what season it belonged to and had given up trying. Vivian parked on Maplewood Street at 5:58 and sat in the car for 2 minutes. Not because she was nervous, exactly, but because she was aware that she was crossing a line she'd spent 4 months approaching by degrees, and that once you crossed certain lines, you couldn't uncross them, and she wanted to be deliberate about it. The street looked different than it had in March. The oaks were fully leafed now, making a tunnel of the block that the March light had only suggested. Eleanor Whitmore's front garden had gone from bare beds to something aggressively, defiantly green. Petunias in the window boxes, a rose trellis beginning to assert itself along the porch railing. The Torres kids from 18 were on their front steps arguing about something with the particular investment that only siblings achieved. Abe was on his front steps without the newspaper for once, just sitting in the early evening warmth with a glass of something and the look of a man who had decided this was enough. The maple tree in front of 44 was in full leaf. The front porch light was on even though it was still light out. Through the front window she could see the warm interior glow of a house that was being lived in. She got out of the car and went up the front walk. Lily opened the door before she knocked. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt and had paint on her left forearm that was either art project or dinner preparation, and she was holding the door open with the unself-conscious authority of someone who'd been told a guest was coming and had decided to be the one who handled it. "You actually came," Lily said. Not accusatory, more like she'd been running a small private probability calculation and was updating it. "I said I would," Vivian said. Lily considered this. "Dad said you didn't say things you didn't mean." "He was right." "Yeah, he usually is." She stepped back to let Vivian in. "He's in the kitchen. It's pasta. He only makes pasta when he's not sure about something because pasta is hard to ruin." "What's he not sure about?" Lily looked at her with those wide, frank eyes. "I don't know. You, maybe." She said it with complete neutrality, the way 12-year-olds stated things they hadn't yet learned to soften. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. Vivian stood in the hallway for a half-second. Then she followed. The kitchen smelled like garlic and something with white wine in it, and Hayes was at the stove with his back to the door, managing 2 burners simultaneously with the practiced economy of someone who'd learned to cook out of necessity and had arrived somewhere past mere competence. He had a dish towel over one shoulder and his sleeves up, and he looked up when she came in, and there was a moment, brief, specific, where she saw his face before he arranged it, and what was on it was something uncomplicated and genuine that he managed to fold into a more ordinary expression before it fully registered. 6 o'clock, he said. 5:59, she said. Lily, set the table. I know, Lily said, already pulling open a drawer with the resigned competence of someone who'd heard this instruction enough times to execute it without engagement. Vivian sat at the kitchen table and watched Hayes cook and watched Lily set the table with the particular combination of care and carelessness that 12-year-olds brought to tasks they knew mattered to their parents. And she thought that this was an ordinary thing. Dinner, a kitchen, the sounds of it. And that ordinary things were not actually ordinary at all. They just looked that way from outside. Croft, she said. You called him today? This afternoon. Hayes didn't turn from the stove. We're meeting Tuesday, his office. He adjusted the heat on one burner. He wants to bring two of his partners into the initial conversation. I said that was fine. Did you tell him what you're looking for in the structure? I told him I was licensing, not selling. Core patents stay with the holding entity. Derivative applications can be sub-licensed, but I retain approval rights on major manufacturing partners. He paused. He said that sounded like a conversation he could have. Oh, that's Croft for yes, she said. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. You know him. I know people who know him, well enough. She folded her hands on the table. Take an attorney to Tuesday's meeting, not just Sandra, someone with licensing structure experience specifically. Sandra's already connected me with someone, a colleague of hers who did the framework on 2 major software licensing deals in the last 5 years. He moved something from one pan to another with a confidence that suggested he'd done it before. I'm not walking in unprepared. I know you're not. You were going to say it anyway. Old habit, she said. He almost smiled. Lily, coming back from the dining room, caught the almost smile and looked between the two of them with the evaluating expression that Vivian was beginning to understand was simply Lily's default, a face she'd been born with and hadn't yet decided to modify. Are you two friends? Lily asked. Conversational. Hayes said, We're figuring that out. At the same moment, Vivian said, I think so. They looked at each other. Lily nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. Okay, she said, and went back to the drawer for napkins. Dinner was good. Not perfect. The pasta was slightly overdone in a way Hayes acknowledged without apology, and Lily mentioned twice, but good in the way that food cooked in someone's actual kitchen for actual people was good, which was different from and better than the restaurant food Vivian ate most evenings alone at her desk or in the back of a car. Lily talked about her school's end-of-year project, which involved building a small structural model and load testing it, and which she explained with a thoroughness that suggested she'd been waiting for an audience with engineering-adjacent interests. Dad says the load distribution is wrong, she said. He showed me the calculation, but I don't think I did it wrong. I think he's trying to get me to redo it his way. I showed you where the calculation was off, Hayes said. You showed me where you thought it was off. Those are the same thing in this case. Dad. Lily gave him the look of someone who had learned to hold their ground. My teacher approved the design. Your teacher approved the concept. That's different from the structural math being right. Vivian looked between them. What's the load tolerance you're working with? Lily told her. Vivian thought about it for a moment. Your dad's probably right about the distribution, she said, which she wasn't technically qualified to confirm, but which seemed, based on the general shape of the argument, to be true. Lily looked at her, then at her father, then back at Vivian. You're on his side. I'm not on anyone's side. I just think the distribution matters. Everyone at this table is an engineer except me, Lily said, with the aggrieved tone of someone who had been outnumbered on a technicality. I'm not an engineer, Vivian said. You think like one. Lily pointed her fork. You ask the same kind of questions Dad asks, like, you want to know how things work, and then you want to know if they'd actually hold up. Vivian looked at Hayes. He was watching his daughter with an expression she recognized now, that private, particular look he had when Lily said something that struck him somewhere he hadn't expected. She's not wrong, he said to Vivian. She's frequently not wrong, Vivian said. Lily absorbed this and returned to her pasta, satisfied. After dinner, Hayes made coffee, and Lily disappeared to the living room with a book, and they sat at the kitchen table with the dinner dishes still on it, the way people did in houses where the dishes could wait. And the evening light was doing its late May thing through the kitchen window, golden and slow. "The Croft deal," Vivian said. "What's the number you're expecting?" He turned his coffee mug in his hands. Sandra's colleague estimates the licensing structure could generate between 200 and 250 million over the initial term, depending on uptake. She thinks there's a floor of around 180 if only 2 or 3 manufacturers come in early. She sat with that number. 200 million, give or take, coming to a man who'd been sitting on it in a rusty garage for 6 years while she'd been standing outside calling the building an eyesore. "Are you ready for that?" she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, that's a significant change, in a lot of ways." She was careful with it. "Money changes the texture of things, even when you've prepared for it." He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "The work doesn't change. The garage doesn't change. Lily's school doesn't change. She's got 2 more years at Maplewood Middle, and she's not going anywhere." He set the mug down. "The house stays." "Obviously the house stays," she said. "Obviously," he agreed. And there was something in that obvious that was the full distance of the last 4 months. The whole arc, from the first morning she'd stood on this street with a buyout offer and an assumption, to now, sitting in this kitchen on a Saturday evening with coffee that was better than the pasta. "Desmond wants to talk to you," she said, "about the project. He has some ideas about the redesign, working around your property rather than through it." I figured he'd come around to that, but he came around faster than I expected, honestly. "Because you made the case," Hayes said. "Don't do that thing where you minimize what you did." She looked at him. "What thing?" "You do it sometimes," he said. "Not unkind. When you've done something right, you attribute it to someone else, or you call it just a phone call or just a conversation. It's not a small thing. You made a choice about what kind of person you were going to be in this situation, and you made it when there was still real cost to making it." He held her eyes. "That matters." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Lily in the next room turning a page. Vivian looked at the table. At the ring stain she'd noticed the first morning she'd sat here. It was still there, would probably always be there. "I came to this street in March thinking I understood it," she said. "I had a plan, a timeline, a budget, a design. I had everything except the most basic thing, which was actually looking at what was here." "Most people don't," he said. "It's not unique to you." "That's not an excuse." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering it as one. I'm saying it's a common way of being in the world. You move fast enough that you don't see what you're moving through, and most of the time nothing important enough is there to stop you." He paused. This time something was. She looked at him. "You weren't going to let me miss it." "I didn't do anything. I just didn't move." "That was enough," she said. He looked at her steadily with that expression she'd come to understand wasn't unreadable. She'd just had to learn to read it. "You know," he said slowly, "the first day you came to this street, when you said the garage was an eyesore, I remember. I wasn't offended. I want you to know that." He picked up his coffee again. "I'd heard it before. Neighbors, whoever, people see a rusted building and they see what they see." He paused. "But when you said it specifically, dressed the way you were, with the way you'd come down the street, like you'd already decided what everything was worth, I thought, this is someone who's going to be interesting to be wrong about." She looked at him. "You thought I was going to be wrong." "I thought you were going to be wrong and then right," he said. "In that order." He set down the mug. "People who are only ever wrong aren't interesting. It's the ones who get it wrong and then actually look that are worth knowing." She absorbed that. Outside, through the kitchen window, Maplewood Street was doing its Saturday evening thing. The Torres kids finally called in from wherever they'd been. The sound of Eleanor Whitmore's television through an open window, Abe's porch light coming on against the beginning of dusk. "Nolan," she said. "Yeah." She thought about how to say the things she'd been thinking about saying for several weeks, since the hallway of the federal building at minimum, and probably before that. She thought about the ways it could be complicated, and the ways it could be simple, and the fact that Hayes was a man who responded better to direct than to indirect, who said what he meant, and waited for you to do the same. "I'd like to have dinner again," she said. "Not here. Out. The two of us." He looked at her. The kitchen was quiet. "Lily will want a full debrief," he said. "I assumed. She'll ask you questions that are more personal than you'd expect." "I can handle questions." "She'll see through whatever you decide to protect," he said. "She got that from her mother. It's not something I can warn her away from." Vivian thought about a woman she'd never met who had grown up 2 blocks from here and had planted a garden that was still in the side yard and whose daughter had her eyes. "I'm not planning to protect much," she said. He nodded once. That nod that had become familiar. The one that closed something and opened something else. "Next Friday," he said. "Next Friday," she said. From the living room, without looking up from her book, Lily said, "I heard that." Hayes closed his eyes briefly with the expression of a man who had no privacy in his own house and had made his peace with it long ago. Vivian laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind she didn't usually produce in front of people she was still figuring out. And Hayes opened his eyes and looked at her when she did. And what was on his face in that moment was something she was going to think about later when she was alone and honest with herself. The formal licensing agreement was signed on the 14th of June. Vivian wasn't in the room when it happened. That wasn't her place, and she understood that clearly. Sandra Park was there with the licensing specialist she'd brought in. Randall Croft was there with his 2 partners and their respective counsel. Hayes was there with his notebook, which she suspected he brought everywhere less from necessity and more because it had been in his pocket long enough to become a kind of ballast. The structure was what Hayes had specified. Core patents retained in the holding entity. Licensing to an initial consortium of 3 major manufacturers. Derivative applications sublicensed with Hayes' approval on significant partnerships. The total value over the initial 12-year term of the agreement was $230 million. With performance escalators if the technology met certain market adoption thresholds, which the manufacturer's own engineers had already assessed as likely. $230 million. Sandra called Vivian at 3:17 in the afternoon. She said, "It's signed," and Vivian said, "Thank you, Sandra," and ended the call and sat in her office for a while doing nothing. Hayes called at 3:45. "Done," he said. "I know, Sandra called." "Of course she did." A pause. "I'm picking Lily up from school in 20 minutes. I haven't told her yet. I wanted to wait until we were in the car so she had somewhere to put it." Another pause. "She knows it was coming. She knows generally what it means, but the actual number is a lot," Vivian said. "It's a lot," he agreed. And she heard in his voice the same thing she'd heard after the determination, that incremental, careful release of something that had been held for a long time. "Do you know what she said to me this morning, before school?" "What?" "She said, like, Dad, when the deal closes, can we get a second car?" He stopped. "I told her we had 2 cars. She said the Cobra didn't count because I never let her touch it." He was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong." Vivian smiled. "Get her a car." "She's 12. Get her one for when she's 16, Vivian said. "Put it in the garage. Give her something to wait for." He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd overstepped into territory she didn't have the standing for yet. Then he said, "That's a good idea, actually. I have them occasionally." "More than occasionally," he said. "I've been updating my estimate. A beat." "Friday's still on." "Friday's still on," she said. She listened to him hang up and sat in her office with the June afternoon coming through her windows and the city doing what cities did below her, and she thought about the nature of certain kinds of value, not the financial kind, though that was real and it mattered, but the kind that accumulated quietly in places people had already decided weren't worth looking at. She thought about how much she'd almost missed. In the weeks that followed the signing, several things happened in the particular overlapping way that made it hard to say which caused which and which simply coincided. Valle Sorrento Partners issued a public statement acknowledging that their patent petition had been resolved and that they wished Hayes Mechanical Solutions success in its licensing endeavors. It was the kind of statement that companies issued when they'd lost and needed to limit further damage, and nobody in the industry who knew the backstory mistook it for anything else. Preston Vale himself was reportedly dealing with a separate and unrelated inquiry from 3 other independent inventors who had retained counsel after reading the Hayes determination's language about documentation standards and ownership chains. Clifford Drummond sent Hayes a card, not an email, an actual card, the physical kind, with a note inside that Hayes read once in the car after picking it up from the mailbox and then put in the kitchen drawer where he kept things that mattered. He told Vivian about it on Friday over dinner at a restaurant that was neither the kind of place that announced itself nor the kind that apologized for itself, which was exactly the kind of place she'd chosen because she thought he'd be comfortable there, and she'd been right. "What did it say?" she asked. "Just that he was glad it worked out, that he'd known it would." Hayes turned his wine glass, and that if I ever wanted to talk engineering again, to call him, that he'd missed having someone around who gave a damn about the actual problems. She thought about Drummond in the hallway of the hearing building, the card he'd paid with points. "He's lonely," she said. "I think so," Hayes said. "Retirement hit him harder than he expected." "Call him," she said. He looked at her. "I was going to." A beat. "I thought maybe a trip to Savannah later in the summer. Lily and I haven't had a real trip since—" He stopped. "In a while." "Since before your wife," she said. Not a question, gently placed. "Since before," he confirmed. He didn't avoid it, didn't change the subject, but he also didn't do anything with it except let it sit where it was. She was learning that this was how he handled the things that hurt, not around them, not through them, just alongside them, in the daily coexistence that was the only honest option. "Tell me about her," Vivian said. He looked up. "If you want to," she said. "You don't have to." He was quiet for a moment, then, "She was an architect, not the corporate kind. She did residential restoration. Old houses, mostly. She had a philosophy about it, which was that most old houses had been modified away from themselves over the years, covered up or changed by owners who didn't understand what they were working with, and her job was to figure out what the house had originally been trying to be and give it back to itself." He paused. "She would have had very specific opinions about your development project." "I imagine so," Vivian said. "She wasn't gentle about bad design," he said. "She was generous about everything else, but bad design made her genuinely angry in a way that nothing else did." Something moved across his face, fond and worn simultaneously. "Lily has that, the thing that makes her angry about the structural model being wrong. That's her mother." Vivian looked at him across the table in the restaurant that didn't announce itself, and she thought about a woman who restored houses back to what they'd originally meant, and the man she'd left behind who'd built something revolutionary in a building that looked like it was falling apart, and the daughter who had her eyes and her intolerance for structural inaccuracy. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Vivian said. "She was," Hayes said. Simply. The best way. The Maplewood Street project was formally redesigned in July. Desmond brought in the lead architect to present 3 alternatives for incorporating the Hayes property into a modified footprint, and Hayes attended the presentation at Vivian's request. He sat in the back of the Sterling Group's conference room with his notebook and listened to the architect walk through the options, and at the end of the presentation, he raised his hand and asked 2 technical questions about the revised foundation approach that the architect answered, and then asked Hayes to clarify further. And by the end of the exchange, they were having the kind of conversation that design professionals have when they recognize each other. Afterward, in the hallway, Desmond shook Hayes' hand. "I owe you an apology," Desmond said. Hayes looked at him. "For what specifically?" "For being willing to use your situation as leverage before I understood what the situation was." He said it directly, which Vivian hadn't been certain he'd do. "That's not a posture I'm comfortable with when I look back at it." Hayes regarded him. "Did you actually use it?" "Vivian talked me out of it before I did." "Then we're fine," Hayes said. He said it without calculation. Genuinely fine, in the way that people who didn't carry grudges efficiently were genuinely fine. "The project redesign works for me. The option 3 footprint is the best from a structural standpoint. Tell your architect the setback on the east elevation should be 4 feet wider than shown, though. The oak root system will cause you problems in 15 years if you don't account for it now." Desmond blinked, looked at Vivian, looked back at Hayes. "I'll tell him." "Good," Hayes said, and went back into the conference room to look at the drawings again. Desmond looked at Vivian with an expression that was somewhere between charmed and unsettled. "Yeah," she said. "I know." Eleanor Whitmore signed in August. Not because of money. The offer had been on the table for 7 months. She signed because Hayes had a conversation with her that Vivian only heard about secondhand, through Lily, who had been in the kitchen playing cards when it happened and had heard most of it through the open window. According to Lily's account, Hayes had told Eleanor that the house she wanted to die in was going to be replaced either way. That was the reality of the situation, and there was no version where the block stayed the way it was. But the question was what happened to the garden she'd spent 40 years building. He told her he had a contact who did residential landscape archiving, photographing, cataloging, and if possible transplanting significant plantings from demolished properties. He said he'd pay for it himself if she'd let him arrange it, and that the archive could be donated to the city's botanical collection in her name. Eleanor had said, according to Lily, "That's the first thing anyone's offered me that wasn't money." She'd signed the following week. Vivian heard this story on a Tuesday evening in August, sitting on Hayes's front porch, which had become, over the preceding 2 months, a place she'd been often enough that she didn't think about the fact of being there, only the fact of where she was. The porch had 2 chairs and a view of the maple tree and the street beyond it, and on summer evenings the oaks made the light complicated and green, and it was one of the better places she'd found herself in recent memory. "You paid for Eleanor's garden archive out of your own pocket," she said. "It wasn't a lot," he said. That's not the point." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "She's lived on this street for 40 years. The garden is evidence of that. Someone should keep the evidence." She looked at him. "You think about evidence a lot." "I think about things that last," he said. "Evidence, documentation, records. Not because I'm paranoid. You're a little paranoid. I'm appropriately cautious," he said, which made her smile. "I think about what persists, what carries through. It's an engineering habit. You want the important things to be findable later." She looked out at Maplewood Street in its August evening state. The oaks were at their fullest, heavy with summer. Somewhere down the block, the Torres kids were in their last weeks of unrestricted summer before school returned. Abe was on his steps. The street was, for the first time since March, a place that felt whole to her. Not complete, because the changes were coming, the construction was coming, the block would look different in 2 years than it did now, but whole in itself, in this moment. "I've been thinking about something," Vivian said. He turned slightly. Not all the way. Hayes rarely turned all the way, like some part of him was always maintaining a reference point. "When I stood on this street in March," she said, "I thought I understood what I was looking at. I had a plan, and I had a number, and I had a timeline, and I thought those things constituted understanding." She paused. "I've spent most of my career moving fast enough that it usually looked like understanding. I'd close a project and move to the next one and tell myself that's how development works. You can't be precious about it. You have to be willing to see the potential rather than the present." "That's not entirely wrong," he said. "Potential matters." "It does," she said, "but I'd confuse seeing potential in a place with understanding it. Those are different things." She looked at the maple tree. "Potential is about what you can make of something. Understanding is about what it already is." He was quiet, listening. "You made me understand that," she said, "by not moving, by just being exactly what you were in the exact place you were and not apologizing for it, and not explaining it to me when I hadn't earned the explanation yet." She paused. "There's something in that I've been trying to figure out how to use in the rest of my work. Not just here." "What have you figured out?" She thought about it honestly. "That the things worth building usually look like something else until you're close enough to really see them," she said, "and that getting close enough requires slowing down in a way that feels like losing time, but isn't." He looked at the street. "My wife used to say that about the houses she restored, that you had to be willing to spend time with the house before you knew what it was asking you to do." He paused. "She said the worst thing you could do was come in with a plan before you'd listened." Vivian sat with that, the weight of it, the specific, plain truth of it. "I came in with a plan," she said. "You did. And then I listened." "Eventually," he said. The tone was dry enough to be honest and gentle enough to be kind, which was the particular register Hayes operated in that she'd come to understand was not something he performed, but something he was. Eventually, she agreed. From inside the house, through the screen door, they could hear Lily in the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing, the particular percussion of a 12-year-old assembling a snack. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in a house that was staying exactly where it was. Vivian thought about what it had taken to get here. Not the negotiations or the hearings or the phone calls, but the internal work of it. The willingness to be wrong after decades of being right. Often enough that wrong had started to feel like someone else's problem. The willingness to let a man in a driveway with grease on his hands and a flat 8-word sentence stop her and make her look. The thing about that kind of change was that it didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with clarity or ceremony. It arrived the way Hayes's spring had arrived on Maplewood Street, incrementally, then undeniably, buds becoming leaves, becoming the full, heavy summer weight of something that had been there all along, waiting to be the right season. She had come to this street to build something. She was still building something. But what she was building had expanded beyond the plans she'd arrived with, into territory she hadn't known to plan for, and that territory turned out to include the porch of a house with a paid-off mortgage and a maple tree and a girl inside making a sandwich and a man beside her who had refused to sell. Not because he was stubborn, but because he knew what he had and had decided it was worth protecting. He had been right. He was, as his daughter said with the resigned certainty of long experience, usually right. The evening light shifted. The oaks made the shadows longer on the street. Down the block, Abe finished whatever was in his glass and stood up from his steps with the deliberate care of a man whose knees made promises they couldn't fully keep and went inside. The Torres household emitted a burst of noise and then went quieter. Maplewood Street in its last full summer, before the construction came and changed it into whatever it was becoming next. And the garage at 44, the rusty, padlocked, patched and weathered garage that an executive in a red dress had called an eyesore on a March morning, sat in the side driveway exactly as it always had, looking from the outside exactly like what it wasn't. "What happens to the garage?" Vivian asked. "When the project builds out around you, does it stay?" "It stays," Hayes said, without hesitation. "It's part of the property. It's part of the—" He stopped, found a different word. "It's where I did the work. Lily knows that. When she's old enough to understand all of what that means, I want her to be able to walk in there and see where it happened." He paused. "My father's Cobra is in there. My wife knew what I was building in there, even if she didn't know all the details. That building has the weight of things in it. You don't demolish something because it looks wrong on the outside." She looked at the garage. From the porch she could see the edge of it beyond the side gate, the corrugated steel going its particular rust color in the evening light. She thought about how it had looked the first time she'd seen it. She thought about what she'd said. "No," she said. "You don't." Lily came out through the screen door with a plate of crackers and something that might have been hummus and sat on the porch railing with the balance of someone who'd been doing it since she was small enough for it to be dangerous and now did it without thinking. "What are you talking about?" she said. "The garage," Hayes said. Lily looked at it. "It needs a paint job." "It does," Hayes agreed. "We could do it this fall, before it gets cold." She ate a cracker. "I want to do the door dark green, like a forest color." "The door is steel," Hayes said. "It needs a specific primer." "I know. I looked it up." She said it with the patient certainty of someone who had anticipated this exact objection. "I can show you." Hayes looked at Vivian. The look had several things in it: amusement, pride, the particular exhaustion of being the parent of someone who did their research. And underneath all of that, something quieter and more permanent, the specific happiness of a person who had built what they meant to build and kept what was worth keeping and found themselves, at the end of a long and difficult road, exactly where they'd decided to be. "Show me tomorrow," he said to Lily. "I will," she said. And on Maplewood Street in the last gold of a summer evening, the garage with its rust and its padlock and its years of silence and its extraordinary interior sat at the edge of the property of a man who had refused to be moved and proved, as it always had, that the most valuable things in the world rarely looked like what they were. You had to go inside to know. You had to be willing to look.